She got into the wrong car, thinking it was an Uber, but the driver was a disguised millionaire, and what started as a mistake turned into an unforgettable meeting. Hello, viewer. Thanks for joining us. Leave a like and share your thoughts in the comments, along with the city you're watching from. Now let's continue with the story. Gabriela Ramirez pressed her phone against her ear as she walked briskly down West 42nd Street, her breath catching in the chilly autumn air. Even beneath her tailored grey suit, she felt a small shiver, though it had nothing to do with the weather. It was nearly 7 in the evening, and she was supposed to be back at the Harp and Reed publishing office by now. Her client, a notoriously picky biographer, was waiting, and Gabriela hated being late. "This is not acceptable," she said, her voice firm but hushed. She was on a call with Marcus, her junior assistant, who was nervously apologizing for a delayed manuscript shipment. "I told you, I need those final pages on my desk no later than 5. It's almost 7. Marcus, in his early 20s and fresh out of college, sounded flustered. "I'm sorry, Ms. Ramirez. I tried to reach the author, but he hasn't responded to any of my emails." "I'll try again." "Thank you," she cut in politely, but with an edge of impatience. She hung up and tucked the phone into her purse. She glanced at her reflection in a nearby window, catching sight of her own tightened jaw and immaculate bun pinned at the nape of her neck. Even at 30, she sometimes felt a decade older. Her honey-brown eyes, usually keen and alert, showed faint fatigue tonight. The day had been unusually demanding. She straightened her blazer, determined to maintain the composed exterior she'd worked so hard to cultivate. Gabriela had come a long way. Born and raised in Miami by her mother, Dolores, she'd been told countless times how bright her future could be if she stayed focused, and focus had indeed propelled her from a modest upbringing to a promising editorial career in Manhattan. She rarely allowed herself to deviate from the path she set. Yet she felt a nagging unease, as if her life, carefully planned to the last detail, were missing a vital spark. Passing a row of food trucks, she inhaled the scent of hot pretzels and roasted nuts, but didn't stop. She was late. Even if she wanted to indulge, duty called. Her phone vibrated again, and she saw her mother's name on the screen. Dolores often phoned around this hour, checking to see if Gabriela had eaten, or if she was taking care of herself. She nearly ignored it, but thought better of it. "Mama," she answered, picking her way through a small crowd gathered at a street corner. "Gabriela, I'm just checking in," Dolores said. Her voice had that gentle warmth Gabriela had grown up with, though she noticed a hint of concern. "Are you all right? You sound stressed, mija." "I'm fine," Gabriela replied, even though she felt a slight twinge of guilt. "Just a long day." Dolores started to mention the possibility of Gabriela visiting Miami for Thanksgiving, but Gabriela hurriedly ended the call, saying she had to rush into another meeting. She promised to call back soon, knowing all too well that soon might not come. At last, she reached the glittering lobby of the glass-fronted building that housed the Harp and Red offices. She stepped inside, nodded at the security guard, and took the elevator to the 20th floor. The ride up felt interminable as she prepared her thoughts for a challenging discussion with the biographer waiting upstairs, but the real strain knotted in her chest. She felt unsettled, though she couldn't put a name to it. The elevator doors slid open. She walked into the corridor, the overhead fluorescent lights buzzing slightly. As she approached her office, she tried to recall a moment, any moment, in the last 6 months when she had done something impulsive, something that didn't align with her carefully orchestrated schedule. The memory wouldn't come. Inside her small corner suite, she noticed the photograph pinned to her corkboard, a younger version of herself, perhaps 12, standing in front of a modest house in Miami with her mother. She remembered that day. She'd sworn to become someone important, to escape any hint of financial struggle, and to never let circumstances catch her off guard. She sometimes wondered if that vow had turned her into a machine. She met briefly with the biographer, offering professional nods and the faintest of smiles, but her mind seemed to be elsewhere. Once the conversation ended, she gathered her belongings, checking the time on her phone. Her day had been squeezed to the last minute, as usual, but now she longed for an early night's rest, something that might reset the mounting stress. Stepping back into the elevator, she pressed the button for the lobby, feeling a yawn take over. When she finally emerged onto the bustling Manhattan sidewalk, she exhaled in relief. All she wanted was to catch a ride, head home, and collapse. She pulled up the rideshare app on her phone, noting that the nearest driver was a few minutes away. Tucking a stray strand of hair back into place, she scanned the street for the make and model of the car the app had promised. Her phone pinged, and a black sedan approached with tinted windows, just like the one described. Gabriella advanced, her mind still on manuscripts and deadlines, and pulled open the door. Without hesitation, she stepped inside, not realizing that she had chosen a car identical in appearance to her expected Uber, but not the actual one. She wouldn't notice until the driver, with a calm voice and eyes of sharp green, said something that made her heart skip a beat. Gabriella settled into the back seat, setting her purse gently beside her. She was still on her phone, half-heartedly typing a message to Marcus apologizing for her earlier harsh tone. She didn't look up until the car had traveled about half a block. "Hey," she began, confused at the route. "I think my GPS said we should turn on—" She paused, noticing something was off. She lifted her eyes to the rearview mirror, catching a glimpse of the driver. He was tall, from what she could tell by his broad shoulders, and sported a slight beard that gave him an air of casual sophistication. His eyes were a clear shade of green that stood out against the evening lights. "I'm sorry," he responded calmly, "but I'm not sure what your GPS told you. I'm actually heading home." Gabriella blinked. "Home? But this is an Uber, isn't it?" He shook his head slowly. "No, it isn't." An immediate wave of embarrassment washed over her. Her heart pounded. "Oh my goodness, I must have gotten into the wrong car," she stammered. "Pull over, please." He flicked the turn signal, yet they were already in a thick tangle of traffic, cars bumper to bumper on a busy Manhattan street. The horns blaring around them made it nearly impossible for him to move aside. "I will," he said, trying to edge into a left lane, "but it might take a moment." Gabriella exhaled sharply, her cheeks flushing. Her mind raced through a dozen possibilities. Could she just get out now, in the middle of traffic? That seemed dangerous. "Let me try to call another ride," she mumbled, fiddling with her phone. The rideshare app seemed to be glitching, and the circle on the screen spun endlessly. "I can drop you off when I turn at the next street," the driver offered. He had a calm, measured voice. There was no trace of anger or annoyance, which surprised her. She glanced at him, then out the window. Rain had begun to fall, and she realized her predicament. No open cabs in sight, no functioning app, and she had just lost her ride. She felt her frustration growing, but also a pinch of curiosity. "I'm sorry about this," she said quietly. "I was distracted and didn't check the license plate." He gave a small nod. "It happens. Honestly, you're not the first person in Manhattan to get into the wrong car, though it's usually just for a second at the curb." They inched forward a few more feet. The traffic ahead looked utterly stagnant, shining brake lights stretching into the distance. "We're going to be stuck for a bit," the driver said with a resigned shrug. "If you want, I can still let you out here, but you won't get far in this weather." She peered through the rain-swept window. People hustled by with umbrellas, jostling in the crowd. "Maybe I should just wait until the next block," she replied, feeling sheepish, yet unsure what else to do. "Suit yourself," he said kindly. I really don't mind. A few minutes passed in awkward silence. The only sounds were the rhythmic sweep of the windshield wipers and the muffled blare of horns. Gabriella's phone vibrated in her palm, but she ignored it, too mortified to talk to anyone just yet. As the car remained at a near standstill, she took a moment to observe the sleek interior. The dashboard had a sophisticated digital console, more advanced than most cars she'd been in. "You've got quite the setup," she said, trying to break the tension. "Looks like you're a fan of technology." The corners of his mouth curved slightly, though he kept his eyes on the road. "You could say that." She cleared her throat. "Right. So, but you live nearby?" She cringed at her own question, realizing it sounded too personal. The driver nodded. "Downtown. I was heading back from a meeting." He paused, then seemed to sense her discomfort. "Look, you're free to call your real Uber any time, but given the traffic, you might be better off waiting until it clears up." Gabriella couldn't deny the common sense in his words. Yes, that might be best. Her gaze lingered on his reflection in the mirror. He seemed collected, not at all flustered by the strange situation. She found that curious, as most people would have shown some degree of annoyance. Her phone buzzed again. This time she saw a text from the actual Uber driver. "Your ride has been cancelled due to no show." She sighed. Perfect. Another wave of irritation and embarrassment swept through her. He caught her eye in the rearview mirror. "Everything all right?" he asked. She managed a short laugh, though she barely felt it. "I missed my real ride, and apparently they're gone." He nodded. "I can let you out on the next corner, if we ever reach it." His tone was gentle enough that she felt her guard lower a bit. "Thank you," she replied, trying to maintain some composure. I really appreciate your patience." They inched forward another few feet, still trapped by the sea of red taillights. The city lights reflected on the wet asphalt, creating a kaleidoscope of colors. Gabriella glanced at her phone, noticing it was nearly 8 now. She realized she had no easy way home. The car crept along at a snail's pace, leaving Gabriella with plenty of time to question her choices. She imagined stepping into the rain, trudging up the sidewalk in soaked heels, hailing a taxi in vain. A part of her was tempted to do just that if it meant escaping the awkward situation. But practicality won out, and she stayed put. "I'm Gabriella, by the way," she finally offered, forcing a polite smile. "Thanks for not throwing me out onto the pavement." He glanced her way. "Brian," he said simply, nodding in acknowledgement. "It's really no trouble." She busied herself by checking emails on her phone, pretending to read them carefully. In truth, she kept stealing glances at him. He was good-looking in a sharp, understated way. She couldn't imagine him as a random chauffeur or a typical office worker. Something about him seemed more poised, more self-assured. Her phone buzzed again. This time, it was Dolores calling. Gabriella hesitated, then answered, "Mama, I'm in the middle of something. Can I call you back?" Her voice came out tenser than she intended. Dolores's voice crackled. "I just wanted to hear your voice. You never call me first, you know." Gabriella stared at the raindrops sliding down the window. "I'm sorry, it's just work. Can we talk tomorrow?" She could almost hear her mother's sigh through the line. "All right, but don't overwork yourself. You know your health matters more than any deadline." "Yes, Mama." She ended the call with a weary note in her voice. Brian shot her a curious look through the rearview mirror. He said nothing, but Gabriella felt a stirring of vulnerability. She hated showing any sign of weakness around strangers. To distract herself, she cleared her throat. "So, Brian, do you do freelance driving?" She realized it was a silly question, even as she asked it. The interior of the car was far too luxurious for a typical rideshare setup. He shook his head, his lips curving into a faint, almost amused smile. Not exactly. Tonight was an exception. She frowned. An exception. He seemed to weigh his words. Let's say I had a meeting that ended early, and I decided to drive myself back rather than have my usual driver pick me up. His tone was polite, but there was a subtle distance. She got the impression that he was used to controlling information. That only piqued her curiosity further. I see, she said slowly, forcing herself not to pry. As they approached another intersection, the traffic halted yet again. The taxi in front of them honked in frustration, but nothing moved. Gabriella felt the tension mounting in her own chest. She was normally in command of her circumstances, or at least she made sure to appear that way. Now, she was in someone else's car, going nowhere. It was an unsettling feeling. She glanced at the digital clock on the dashboard, 8:15. She was reminded of a night long ago, back in Miami, waiting for her father to come home. He never arrived, and the next morning she learned he had left for good. The pang of that memory returned, unbidden. She had promised herself she would never again rely on anyone who could betray her trust. That vow had shaped her life. Brian slowed to a crawl behind the line of cars, letting the wipers rhythmically brush away the rain. Gabriella noticed a tension in his jaw now, as if the gridlock was finally testing his patience. "Look," she said, her voice quieter, "I appreciate you letting me stay until we find a better spot for me to get out. If it gets to the next block and it's still jammed, I'll just walk." He tilted his head. "In this weather." A shrug. "I've handled worse." She tried to make it sound dismissive, but her words held an edge of defiance. He paused, as though choosing his next words carefully. "Well, if you'd rather avoid a stormy stroll, I can at least get you closer to where you live. Where's home?" There it was again, that gentle tone. She could hardly believe he wasn't irritated. Something about his composure unnerved her almost as much as the circumstances. She told him the cross streets of her neighborhood. A faint look of recognition crossed his face. "I can manage that. Let's see how much progress we can make." Gabriella's mind whirled. She thought of stepping out, calling a friend, maybe even a taxi, but pride and exhaustion held her back. Another wave of hesitation swept over her. She sensed a shift in the atmosphere, as though both of them were weighing invisible burdens neither dared to speak of. The rain drummed on the windshield, and a gust of wind rattled the car doors. Brian tried merging into an open lane, but the jam extended in every direction. He sighed and turned to Gabriella briefly. "Looks like we're stuck for a little while longer." She noticed the glow of neon signs reflected on his face, a rolling ad for some Broadway show. It reminded her of the thousands of stories unfolding in Manhattan each night, every person rushing to meet a deadline, a date, or a dream. She straightened her posture, forcing her shoulders back as if to physically contain her anxiety. Her phone chimed yet again. This time, it was an email from her editor-in-chief at Harper Reed, reminding her of a team meeting at 8 a.m. sharp the next day. She felt the familiar knot of stress twist in her stomach. It was already past 8:30 p.m. She was nowhere near home, and she still had to prepare notes for that meeting. Brian noticed her expression. "Bad news?" he asked gently. She locked her screen. "Just work," she said, mustering a polite but curt reply. "Deadlines, meetings, the usual." He nodded. "I've had my share of deadlines, but you seem particularly stressed." A flicker of annoyance lit inside her. She hated being told she looked stressed. However, she reined it in. "I'm just used to controlling my schedule," she admitted. "Tonight, well, clearly, things didn't go as planned." His eyes flicked toward her in the rearview mirror. Not everything in life follows a plan. It was such an obvious statement, yet it struck a chord. Gabriella pressed her lips together. So I'm learning. Silence settled again, broken only by the staccato of rain and distant horns. She realized she felt hungry, but was reluctant to say so. A tempting food truck signaled from across the intersection. Hot soup, grilled cheese. Memories of simpler comforts tugged at her. Suddenly, her phone rang. The caller ID, Raphael. Her chest tightened. She and Raphael had dated briefly months ago, a relationship that her mother desperately wanted to turn into an engagement. He was stable, polite, and successful. A perfect match in Dolores's eyes. But Gabriella had seen no spark, just a shared obsession with professional success. She let it ring until it went to voicemail. Brian cleared his throat. If you need to take that call, feel free. I don't mind, she shook her head. It's nothing urgent. For a moment, neither spoke. The conversation about plans and unpredictability lingered in the air. Gabriella fought a pang of guilt as she recalled how she'd ended things with Raphael, citing her demanding schedule rather than admitting she felt no connection. She gazed out the window, where pedestrians scurried under umbrellas, each figure a blur of motion and rain. A flicker of lightning illuminated the street, and she heard a distant rumble of thunder. Brian tapped the steering wheel lightly, the only outward sign of impatience he'd shown so far. How about we pull over at that coffee shop up ahead, he suggested, pointing to a small, warm-lit cafe just off the corner. If the traffic's not moving, at least we can wait it out somewhere dry. She hesitated. Her first instinct was to decline, worried about the implications of sitting in a cafe with a complete stranger, but she saw the queue of motionless cars and realized she might be there for hours if she stayed on this route. Her phone buzzed again, her editor-in-chief this time, probably expecting immediate answers. Gabriella felt a surge of frustration. All right, she sighed. I guess that wouldn't hurt. Brian steered carefully into a side street, and after a painstaking attempt to edge through the congestion, he finally found a space near the cafe. They stepped out into the damp air. She hugged her blazer around herself. The cafe's warm glow felt almost comforting, like a beacon in the storm. They entered, greeted by the aroma of freshly ground coffee and the subdued murmur of other stranded patrons. A kindly older barista stood behind the counter, offering a sympathetic nod. Gabriella realized she and Brian were both soaked at the edges from the rain, though he seemed unbothered by the discomfort. He motioned to a small table near the window, letting her sit down first. I'll grab us something warm, he said. Espresso? Cappuccino? She paused. A cappuccino would be nice. While he headed to the counter, she took in the environment, a few wooden tables, softly lit lamps, and a handful of customers wearing weary but patient expressions. She thumbed through her phone again, checking for urgent emails. All she saw were endless demands for her time. She rubbed her eyes and tried not to think about the stack of manuscripts on her desk. A quiet voice within told her that, for once, she might actually benefit from an unscheduled pause. In the cozy glow of the cafe, Gabriella unbuttoned her blazer, grateful for a brief respite from her frenzied routine. As she glanced around, she noticed a vintage bookshelf lined with second-hand paperbacks. A wave of nostalgia washed over her. She remembered the nights she spent buried in novels, long before her own editorial duties robbed her of leisure reading. Brian returned with 2 steaming cappuccinos, placing one gently before her. She offered a small nod of thanks, inhaling the rich aroma. This was kind of you, she said, her voice quieter than before. He shrugged modestly, taking a seat opposite her. Given the circumstances, it seemed like the best option. She studied him more closely now in the soft light. His hair was slightly damp, and tiny droplets clung to the stubble along his jaw. There was a quiet confidence about him, as if he was used to making decisions in tense situations. They sipped their drinks in silence for a moment, listening to the cafe's faint jazz music. Outside, raindrops slid down the wide glass window, distorting the glow of streetlights. She noticed that a few other customers were also waiting out the storm, some absorbed in their phones, others talking in low voices. Brian leaned back, looking at her. "You mentioned you work in publishing," he said. "Are you an editor or something else?" She nodded. "Yes, an editor. I specialize in shaping non-fiction works, memoirs, biographies, and sometimes social commentaries." A hint of amusement touched his eyes. "Interesting. You must read a lot, then." Her face softened. "I do. Though these days it feels more like analyzing than enjoying. Deadlines don't exactly allow me to savor every sentence." He gave a thoughtful hum. "That's the trade-off, I guess, turning a passion into a profession. I've seen that happen in my field, too." She took another sip, feeling the creamy warmth ease her nerves. "What field is that? You mentioned you had a meeting." He hesitated a beat too long before answering. "I'm in tech." She raised an eyebrow. "The city's full of people in tech. Care to be more specific?" He set his cup down, the ceramic clinking softly on the saucer. "Let's just say I'm working on a new transportation platform," he replied, choosing his words carefully. "We're hoping it'll improve how people navigate crowded cities. There's a lot of competition, but we think we have a unique edge." Gabriella nodded slowly, intrigued despite herself. She'd written a few blog pieces criticizing certain rideshare companies for their lack of attention to driver safety and passenger data privacy, but she decided not to bring that up. "Sounds ambitious," she said instead. "It is," he agreed, his gaze drifting out the window. "Sometimes I wonder if it's worth the stress, but I guess anything worthwhile comes with a risk." She could relate, though she didn't say so. Instead, she allowed a small smile. "Most of my life has been about managing risk. I hate surprises," he chuckled. "Then this entire evening must be a nightmare for you." There was warmth in his tone, and she found herself relaxing. "I wouldn't go that far, but yes, I like to keep my schedule neat. This was definitely not on the agenda." They fell silent again, and the cafe's jazz track switched to a softer, lilting melody. A kind-faced older woman behind the counter glanced at them, smiling as if she recognized a moment of calm in their posture. Gabriella wondered if the barista saw them as a couple, or just two strangers forced to share a table by circumstance. Glancing at her phone, Gabriella noticed the storm warning flashing across the screen. "It says the rain should ease in about an hour," she murmured. "Guess we're stranded until then." Brian didn't appear troubled by it. "Could be worse." His casual demeanor almost made her envious. She lived her life in perpetual motion, always chasing time, never pausing to let it catch up. She took a final sip of her cappuccino, savoring the last bit of foam. "So," she ventured, "after this rain lets up, will you just drive home?" He shrugged. "Likely, unless you need that ride." She hesitated, her mind flicking between acceptance and self-preservation. Asking him for a ride felt like stepping past some invisible line, but then again, her app still malfunctioned, and the cabs were scarce in such a downpour. "I might take you up on it," she said, voice low. He nodded, and she thought she saw a faint gleam of satisfaction in his eyes. Perhaps he was just being polite, or maybe he genuinely welcomed her company. She couldn't quite tell. Outside, a fresh roll of thunder rumbled through the sky. Gabriella watched the lightning illuminate the wet streets, her stomach twisting with anticipation. Everything about this night felt like a nudge towards something unplanned, something that might shake the careful scaffolding of her life. She tried to ignore the swirl of emotions rising in her chest, reminding herself that in a few hours she'd be home, safe in her apartment, with only the memory of this unusual encounter. Yet even that thought couldn't quell the sense that she was on the cusp of a decision that might change more than just her evening. Gabriella woke the next morning to the shrill insistence of her alarm. She rolled over, silenced it with a tap, and stared at the ceiling for a moment. The memory of the previous night returned, stepping into the wrong car, meeting Brian, and sharing that unexpected coffee break. She felt a mix of curiosity and lingering awkwardness. Part of her was tempted to dismiss the entire event as a bizarre accident, yet another corner of her mind replayed the conversation with quiet fascination. She dressed quickly, choosing a charcoal pencil skirt and a cream-colored blouse, then pinned her hair into its usual impeccable bun. Before heading out, she glanced at her phone to see if any messages had come in. Nothing from Brian, of course. She realized she didn't even have his contact information. Instead, she had a string of emails from Harp and Reed, mostly updates on new manuscript queries and the day's meeting schedule. On her way to the office, she decided to stop by a small cafe near Bryant Park for a change of pace. The line was short, and while waiting, she heard a familiar voice calling her name. Turning, she spotted Eleanor Clark, a senior editor in her mid-50s who was both colleague and a kind of guide whenever Gabriella needed perspective. Eleanor wore a bright red scarf over her simple black dress, her silver hair styled in a neat bob. "Gabriella, dear," Eleanor said, stepping out of line to greet her with a gentle hug. "I was just thinking about you. My sixth sense must have kicked in." Gabriella offered a polite smile. "It's good to see you. I was actually hoping we could chat. I had a strange night." Eleanor's brow arched with curiosity. "Strange, how?" They ordered their coffees, then settled at a small table by the window. Morning light filtered in, illuminating the swirling steam above their cups. Gabriella leaned in, lowering her voice. She recapped how she ended up in the wrong car, meeting a man named Brian, who claimed to be involved in a new tech venture. She admitted she felt oddly drawn to the entire scenario, yet she couldn't shake her discomfort at having stepped off her usual path. Eleanor listened intently, sipping her latte. She offered no immediate judgment, only nodding at the right moments. Then she set down her cup with a thoughtful expression. "You've always managed your life down to the minute," she began. "It's part of why you've risen so quickly here. You plan well, you anticipate problems, but maybe this coincidence was more than just a mishap. Perhaps it was a little nudge." Gabriella swallowed, recalling how Brian had calmly guided her through that awkward predicament. "A nudge toward what?" Eleanor tilted her head. "Sometimes we spend so much effort trying to control everything that we lose out on opportunities for real growth, unexpected connections, fresh insights. Could be that this Brian fellow is a door to something new, if you can let yourself walk through it." Gabriella fiddled with her cup. "I've always stayed away from randomness," she murmured, "especially after, my dad left our family without warning, and I promised I'd never rely on unpredictable elements again." Eleanor reached across the table, giving Gabriella's hand a reassuring squeeze. "I recall you sharing that once. I'm not suggesting you throw caution to the wind, dear. I'm saying that sometimes life's best developments don't come from what you plan, but from how you respond to what you never saw coming." The words sank in deeply. Gabriella understood that Eleanor was speaking not just as an editor, but also as someone who'd seen her own share of life's curveballs. Eleanor often told stories about how she'd abandoned a chance to move to London in her 30s, letting fear of the unknown hold her back. Even now, she expressed regret over that choice. Before Gabriella could respond, Eleanor's phone buzzed. She glanced at the screen. "We've got 10 minutes before the acquisitions meeting. We should hurry, or we'll be late." They finished their coffees, then walked together through the brisk morning air toward the Harp and Red building. Just before entering the lobby, Eleanor stopped Gabriella with a light touch on her shoulder. "If fate offers you a genuine chance to explore something outside your comfort zone, don't ignore it," she said softly. "That's all I'll say." Gabriella pressed her lips together, nodding in quiet acknowledgement. Inside, they took the elevator to the 20th floor. The moment the doors opened, they were greeted by the usual hustle, assistants carrying stacks of paper, editors conferring in hushed tones, authors pacing anxiously in the waiting area. Gabriella dived into her day, organizing notes and leading a discussion on upcoming releases. Still, throughout the morning, her mind drifted back to Eleanor's words and the events of the night before. By lunch, she found herself checking her blog's comment section, more out of habit than expectation. She'd written a piece 2 weeks prior criticizing a major tech CEO for ignoring privacy concerns. She frowned when she saw a new comment from someone with the initials BP, who engaged her points with measured, logical counterarguments. Gabriella's heart skipped a beat, realizing that BP could very well stand for Brian Pierce. Though she couldn't be certain, she leaned back in her chair, unsure why her pulse quickened. Perhaps it was nothing, just a random person with the same initials. But maybe, just maybe, it was the same man from last night, responding to her criticisms in a thoughtful way. She thought again about Eleanor's advice. A door might be opening, if only she dared to cross the threshold. That evening, Gabriella returned to her apartment in the Upper West Side, a small but well-organized one-bedroom with tall windows overlooking a row of brownstones. The moment she stepped inside, she toed off her heels and dropped her briefcase near the sofa. Normally, she would spend her free hours poring over manuscripts or drafting editorial feedback, but a restless spark within refused to let her settle into the usual rhythm. She moved to the kitchen, flicked on the overhead light, and rummaged for something quick to eat. Leftover takeout stared back at her from the fridge, but she decided she wasn't hungry for the same old meal. Instead, she heated water for tea, pacing the living room as she waited. The memory of the cappuccino she'd shared with Brian the night before still lingered. Her phone lit up with an incoming call from her mother. She debated letting it go to voicemail, but guilt pushed her to answer. "Mama!" Dolores's voice poured through, warm but tinged with worry. "I was hoping we could talk. You sounded rushed yesterday." Gabriella softened, remembering how many times Dolores had stood by her. "I know. I've just been busy." "Too busy to call your own mother," Dolores teased gently before turning serious. "Tell me how you are, mija. Really." Gabriella leaned against the counter, her reflection in the window showing tension in her face. "I'm all right, Mama. Work is hectic. I have a new project coming up and I met someone." She surprised herself by admitting it aloud, though she wasn't even sure meeting Brian counted as more than an accident. Dolores latched on to the hint of personal news. "Oh, met someone. A new man in your life." Heat rose to Gabriella's cheeks. "Not exactly," she said, choosing her words cautiously. "It was just an odd encounter. I don't know where it will lead, if anywhere." Her mother pressed gently, but Gabriella sidestepped the details, promising to share more later. Dolores reminded her not to let life pass her by in the name of career obligations. After they hung up, Gabriella stood in silence, staring at the phone. It seemed everyone around her, Eleanor, Dolores, sensed she needed a change, even if she resisted it. She clicked open her laptop, intending to review a manuscript, but her fingers drifted to the blog site instead. She scrolled to the comment section and found the conversation with BP still fresh. Something about his tone reminded her of Brian's calm, measured way of speaking. She reread his arguments, noticing they were free of the usual online hostility. He posed thoughtful questions, challenging her stance about large tech corporations. On impulse, she drafted a reply. "I see your point about innovation and ethical responsibility. Perhaps I was too quick to judge from the outside. I'd be interested to learn more about how your company addresses these concerns." Her heart thumped as she hit send. This was unlike her. She normally stuck by every word she wrote, rarely budging an inch in online debates. Now, she was essentially inviting a deeper discussion. Maybe it was foolish, but a voice in her mind whispered about stepping outside the rigid lines she'd drawn. After a restless hour of skimming editorial tasks, she closed her laptop. The clock read 9 p.m. She stared at her neatly arranged bookshelf, everything in alphabetical order by author surname. She'd maintained that system since college, a testament to her meticulous nature. But tonight, the structure of her life felt claustrophobic. Acting on an impulse she couldn't fully explain, she opened the rideshare app on her phone, typed in Pierce Tech as a destination, and stared at it. She'd read about the company in passing, an emerging star in the tech world, rumored to be developing cutting-edge transportation software. She hesitated, not even sure they'd be open at this hour. Finally, she turned off her phone, the adrenaline surge fading. She sank onto the couch, rubbing her temples. Brian had said something about a meeting and wanting to drive himself. The more she thought about it, the more she suspected he was no ordinary entrepreneur. If the man behind BP was indeed Brian Pierce, the same CEO she'd once criticized for privacy oversights, then she was stepping into murky territory. Yet another side of her wrestled with the possibility that this was an opportunity. She could see for herself if there was truth behind his vision. She might even discover a chance to write a piece that went beyond her usual editorial boundaries. She glanced around the orderly confines of her apartment. Taking a risk wasn't her style. It never had been. But the plan she'd so carefully crafted for her life, one without big emotional gambles, suddenly felt incomplete. She told herself she would give it some time, maybe a day or two, to think it over. 2 days later, Gabriella found herself standing outside a sleek, glass-walled building in Lower Manhattan. The facade reflected the cloudy sky, and the modern architecture stood in stark contrast to the older brick structures nearby. She clutched a visitor's badge given to her by a young receptionist, who had politely escorted her to the elevator bank for Pierce Tech. She hadn't planned on actually showing up here so soon, but the email invitation was too intriguing to ignore. It arrived that morning from info.piercetech.com, inviting her to a private demonstration of a new transportation platform. The message referenced her invaluable editorial insights and offered a discreet preview of something that could reshape urban mobility. She couldn't help but suspect that Brian was behind the invitation. The security guard at the entrance gave her a once-over before waving her through. Now she stood in front of elevator doors, each polished metal panel reflecting her own somewhat anxious expression. When the doors slid open on the 14th floor, she stepped out into a minimalist reception area. Polished concrete floors stretched beneath LED lights, and modern furniture in a muted palette dotted the space. A large Pierce Tech logo was mounted on the main wall, the letters cleanly designed in silver against a charcoal backdrop. Before she could fully take in the surroundings, a friendly woman approached her. She was in her mid-30s, with short, stylishly cropped hair and a determined set to her jaw. "You must be Gabriella Ramirez," she said, extending her hand. "Welcome to Pierce Tech. I'm Rachel Anderson, the lead engineer on our new mobility project." Gabriella shook her hand, noting the firm grip and warm demeanor. "It's nice to meet you," she replied, adjusting the strap of her purse nervously. "I wasn't entirely sure what to expect," Rachel smiled, gesturing for her to follow down a hallway. "We value privacy here, so we sent out a select few invitations. Brian said you'd likely have valuable feedback on how to present our platform to the media. At the mention of Brian's name, Gabriella felt her pulse quicken. She nodded, trying to remain composed. I'm curious to see what you're working on. They passed a row of glass-walled conference rooms, each occupied by small teams huddled around laptops and whiteboards. The atmosphere felt charged with focused energy, quite different from the hush of editorial offices. A faint hum of electronics underlined the air, as if the entire floor buzzed with possibilities. Rachel led her into a lab space lined with workstations. Monitors displayed interface designs, coding windows, and test maps of major city grids. A few developers typed away, barely glancing up, engrossed in their tasks. In the center of the room sat a sleek model of a dashboard console, reminiscent of a futuristic car interior. We're building an advanced ride-share system, Rachel explained, placing a hand on the console's curved surface. But more than that, it's an entire framework for safer and more efficient urban travel. We want to integrate electric vehicles, AI routing, and transparent driver-passenger data policies to alleviate congestion and reduce carbon emissions. Gabriella listened carefully, nodding. I've written about these issues, she said. Most of my critiques center on companies ignoring consumer privacy or cutting corners in driver training. Rachel's eyes sparkled with determination. Exactly. That's where we hope to set ourselves apart. We've dedicated a big chunk of resources to encryption, data protection, and real-time safety checks. As Gabriella took in the sheer scope of the project, she heard footsteps approaching. She turned to see Brian stepping into the lab. He wore a navy blazer over a casual dress shirt, and a hint of surprise flashed across his features when their eyes met, though his composure quickly returned. You made it, he said in a warm tone, offering her a measured smile. I wasn't sure you would accept the invitation. She swallowed the spike of nerves. The demonstration intrigued me. I wanted to see what all the fuss is about. A flicker of amusement crossed his face as he gestured toward the console. Rachel here is the mastermind behind the coding and structure. I'm more on the vision side, making sure we're pushing boundaries in the right way. Rachel laughed softly. He's being modest, she said to Gabriella. He's done more debugging than most CEOs I know. Gabriella considered the interplay between them. There was clear, mutual respect, a camaraderie that suggested they worked well together. A small corner of her mind noted how different this was from the typical hierarchical approach she'd seen in large corporations. Brian motioned for them to gather around a monitor displaying a live test environment. We've set up a simulated city grid. We can show you how the routing algorithms handle peak hour congestion. Gabriella watched as Rachel typed a few commands, and the screen populated with moving dots representing vehicles. Arrows indicated optimized routes. She saw how the system rerouted cars in real time to avoid traffic bottlenecks. It's impressive, she conceded, carefully masking just how impressed she really was. If this works as intended, it could ease a lot of frustrations for urban commuters. Brian nodded, his expression earnest. That's our goal. But we need to refine our messaging, help potential users and investors understand we're not just another rideshare. We're creating a new ecosystem. Gabriella started to see glimpses of the big picture. The scale of the ambition was enormous. She also recognized the risk. Any misstep could lead to massive backlash or financial loss. It was the kind of high-stakes endeavor she'd usually criticize if corners were cut. Yet nothing here suggested corner cutting. If anything, the company seemed overly committed to transparency. She reminded herself of her role. She wasn't here to be dazzled. She was here to evaluate whether Brian's project was as genuine as it seemed. Rachel left them to speak with a technician, and Brian guided Gabriella to a nearby lounge area for coffee, giving them a moment away from the bustle of the lab. Brian poured 2 cups of coffee from a sleek machine in the lounge corner. The space, though minimalistic, offered comfortable seating and a tranquil view through floor-to-ceiling windows. Late afternoon light cast a warm glow over the cityscape, dulling the sharp angles of distant skyscrapers. Gabriella settled into a chair, taking the coffee he handed her with a nod of thanks. She inhaled the aroma before speaking. "I didn't realize your operation was this extensive," she admitted. I assumed you were just another tech executive touting big ideas." He paused a moment, choosing his words. "I get that a lot. But we've spent years on research and prototypes. I've poured most of my resources into it. Makes me something of a fanatic, I suppose." She studied his face. There was a subtle tension in his jaw, as though an undercurrent of pressure lingered beneath his calm exterior. "A fanatic, maybe, but you seem motivated by more than money. Otherwise, you wouldn't invest so heavily in data privacy or the environment," he shrugged. "I've seen how corners get cut. That's not a legacy I want to leave." They shared a quiet moment, sipping coffee, while the sounds of distant conversation filtered in from the lab. Gabriella caught herself remembering the night they met. How strange it had been to sit in the back of his car, thinking he was just a random driver. Now she was in his domain, surrounded by a team that clearly respected him. She shifted in her seat. "I appreciate that you invited me here. It shows you're willing to be transparent, at least to some degree." He set his coffee down. "I read your blog posts more carefully after that night," he confessed. "You raise valid concerns, some that our industry tends to ignore. Figured maybe we could use a bit of that critical eye." Her brow furrowed slightly. "I am critical," she said, not wanting him to think she'd give his company a free pass just because of some personal connection. "If I find anything that contradicts your claims, I'll say so." A faint smile tugged at the corner of his mouth. "Good. I'd be disappointed if you didn't." Just then, Rachel peeked into the lounge, gesturing for Brian to come over. "We have that conference call with the user interface team in 10 minutes, she reminded him. Then to Gabriella, she added, "Feel free to explore the floor. Our VR station might interest you. Walk around, see how the app looks from a driver's perspective." Once they were alone again, Brian rose. "I have to jump on that call, but please make yourself at home. If you need anything, just ask." Gabriella nodded, watching him leave with Rachel. She finished her coffee and set the cup aside. Standing, she wandered down a hallway lined with big screens displaying rotating data visualizations. At the end, she discovered a room where a small sign read "Driver Experience Simulation." Inside, she found a VR headset on a table next to a simulation rig that resembled a car dashboard. Intrigued, she slipped on the headset, and a cityscape materialized before her eyes in vivid detail. She experimented with the controls, noticing how the system provided real-time signals about traffic flow, passenger details, and environmental data. She felt a jolt of excitement. This was more than a gadget. If properly implemented, it could fundamentally shift how rideshare drivers navigate and respond to city congestion. She spent a few minutes testing routes, scanning passenger requests, and even toggling safety features that alerted the driver if something was amiss. When she removed the headset, she noticed Neil Carter, introduced briefly as the marketing lead, standing by the doorway. He was a tall man with an athletic build, wearing casual business attire. He offered a polite grin. "So that's our VR sneak peek. Not many outside the team have tried it." Gabriella brushed back a stray hair that had come loose from her bun. "It's impressive. Everything about this project has been more advanced than I expected." He inclined his head in thanks. Rachel and Brian push for excellence. They refuse to settle, which is refreshing, even if it keeps the rest of us on our toes. She gave him a thin smile, still absorbing all she'd seen. "And you handle marketing. That must be a challenge, balancing the idealistic side with what the public wants to hear." "Exactly," he replied. "We can't just say, 'We're revolutionizing ride shares.' People roll their eyes at buzzwords. We need to show tangible benefits like safer routes, less congestion, reduced carbon footprint, stuff that truly matters. Gabriella nodded in agreement, remembering her own blog critiques about empty corporate promises. That's a tall order, but I can see the substance behind it. They strolled back into the corridor, passing clusters of desks where programmers chatted about code. Neil glanced at her. I heard you're an editor. Guess that means you're used to spotting holes in a story. If you notice any holes here, I'm sure Brian would want to know. She managed a wry smile. Trust me, I'll be looking. Neil laughed good-naturedly. Figured you would. He excused himself to return to a meeting. Alone again, Gabriella found her thoughts racing. She had come expecting to find either corporate spin or half-baked ideas. Instead, she discovered a focused team, innovative technology, and a sense of genuine purpose. It was a world far removed from her daily editing tasks, yet it resonated with her more than she cared to admit. She checked her watch, realizing she'd spent nearly an hour exploring. Before she left, she glimpsed Brian through a glass partition, locked in conversation with Rachel and two other team members. He caught sight of her, raising a hand in a small wave. She nodded back. Despite the glass between them, she felt an odd sense of closeness. Early the next morning, Gabriella was at her desk at Harp and Reed, reviewing a manuscript about urban planning. The author wrote passionately about city congestion, painting a grim picture of pollution and overstressed public transport systems. As she made notes in the margins, her thoughts drifted to PearceTech's proposed solution. She wondered how the author would react to such technology, whether it might align or clash with his vision for more walkable cities. She found herself drafting an email to him, suggesting he explore new tech initiatives as part of his research. It was a small, almost subconscious step, linking her professional work to what she'd seen at PearceTech. Later that afternoon, she received a call from Eleanor, who was out of the office on a book scouting trip. Any breakthroughs in your life, Gabriella? She teased lightly. Gabriella leaned back in her chair. Well, I visited that tech company, she confided. They're building something far more substantial than I expected. Eleanor sounded pleased. That's good to hear. You know, I always say that new perspectives can help us grow, personally and professionally. After the call, Gabriella responded to a message from BP, who'd left another comment on her blog. His remarks were measured, even scholarly, critiquing certain oversights in the rideshare industry and advocating for stronger consumer protections. She found herself looking forward to his posts. Though he never explicitly confirmed his identity, she felt sure it was Brian. Her day passed in a blur of meetings and editorial reviews. By late afternoon, she was surprised by a text from Rachel inviting her to join a small PearceTech gathering that evening. Just a casual dinner with some of the dev team, Rachel wrote. We'd love your insights. We'll be at a restaurant near Times Square, 7 p.m. Gabriella hesitated before replying. Part of her balked at socializing with people she barely knew, especially after hours, but another side recalled how energized she felt exploring the PearceTech offices. Her curiosity about Brian, too, simmered in the back of her mind. She typed out, "Count me in." Thank you for the invitation. That evening, she arrived at a modest Italian eatery, La Piazza, where the lively chatter of patrons and the scent of garlic and tomato sauce greeted her at the door. She spotted Rachel seated at a round table with Neil and two other individuals, Haruka, a data analyst, and Jonas, a UX designer. Brian was notably absent. Rachel waved her over. "Welcome. Hope you're ready for some good food." "We practically live on takeout most days." Gabriella slipped into the empty chair. "Smells amazing," she said, accepting a menu. She introduced herself to Haruka, a reserved woman with quick, observant eyes, and Jonas, a lanky man in his late 20s who wore wire-rimmed glasses and an eager grin. The conversation flowed easily. They talked about the day's coding triumphs, design challenges, and the unstoppable march of new feature requests. Despite the complexity of their work, they conveyed passion and camaraderie. Over plates of pasta and fresh bread, they asked Gabriella about her editorial world, about how she shaped narratives and guided authors to refine their message. Neil raised his glass of water. We're all storytellers in a way, right? We shape how people perceive technology. Gabriella shapes how readers perceive an author's message. The synergy seems obvious. Gabriella smiled at the thought. She was surprised by how comfortable she felt among these people. Typically, she maintained a certain professional distance at corporate dinners, but the atmosphere here was warm, almost familial. Midway through the meal, Brian walked in. He offered a brief smile of apology for being late and took the remaining seat next to Gabriella. The group welcomed him with teasing remarks about him working too hard, and he waved them off good-naturedly. As the server brought another plate, Gabriella caught Brian's eye. "Busy day?" she asked quietly, noticing the shadows under his eyes. He shrugged, taking a sip of water. "Meetings? Mostly. Trying to finalize investment details and coordinate a pilot rollout." The others chimed in about the investor pitches, each offering an anecdote or insight. The conversation soon turned lively, with Rachel poking fun at overly cautious venture capitalists who demanded unrealistic timelines. Brian chimed in now and then, but mostly he listened, letting his team vent frustrations and share small victories. Gabriella noticed how he fostered a collaborative atmosphere, never hogging the spotlight. It was a stark contrast to other tech moguls she'd written about, individuals who dominated every discussion. Brian seemed to trust his team's expertise, which spoke volumes about his leadership style. Neil proposed a toast with his glass of water. "To pushing boundaries without losing ourselves. May we keep things human, even as we make them high-tech." The table echoed his sentiment with clinks of glasses. Gabriella felt an unexpected swell of emotion. She recognized a genuine sense of purpose here, and it resonated with her own yearning for something beyond typical editorial deadlines. She realized she was among people who believed passionately in their work, and they were inviting her, an outsider, to share in that vision. After dinner, as the group trickled out of the restaurant into the neon-lit bustle of Times Square, Brian lingered beside Gabriella. They watched the throngs of tourists and glowing billboards, the city swirling with possibility. She could sense the unspoken questions that hovered between them, questions about what came next, about her true intentions, and about why they kept finding themselves in each other's orbit. The next day, Gabriella stepped out of the subway near her office, only to find an email waiting in her inbox with a subject line that made her stomach drop. "Exclusive tip, Pierce Tech's shady funding." A quick glance revealed it was from an anonymous source, claiming that Brian's operation wasn't as transparent as it seemed. They alleged questionable backers and rumored intellectual property disputes with a former partner. Gabriella's heart thumped. She hurried up the stairs to the harp-and-red floor, scanning the email's content more thoroughly once she was at her desk. The message provided only vague hints, no solid proof, just insinuations. Still, the claims were serious enough that they could damage Pierce Tech's reputation. She sat there, hands poised over her keyboard, unsure of her next move. She was torn between her instinct as a critic, someone who'd exposed corporate wrongdoing in the past, and her emerging sense that Brian and his team truly operated with integrity. Yet she couldn't dismiss the possibility of a hidden scandal, especially in a sector rife with ruthless competition. Her phone buzzed, drawing her attention. It was Neil, leaving a voicemail. "We're finalizing an investor deck. Brian asked if you could review some of the language. No pressure, but we'd value your insight. Give me a call when you can." Gabriella stared at the phone, the email's words echoing in her mind. Shady funding, silent partner, stolen code. She felt a knot tighten in her chest. If she simply ignored the tip, she risked being complicit in whatever wrongdoing might exist. If she confronted Brian without evidence, she could strain their tentative bond. She closed her eyes for a moment, inhaling to steady herself. Eleanor was out of the office, or she'd seek her counsel. In the past, Gabriella would have swiftly forwarded the tip to the investigations team at her publishing house. But now she hesitated. She reminded herself that good journalism demanded facts, not rumors. Her thoughts drifted back to the dinner at La Piazza, how genuine Brian and his team had seemed. She remembered Rachel's sincerity about building a safer city. The memory warred with her sense of duty. Finally, she decided to gather more information discreetly. She typed a reply to the anonymous tipster. "Can you provide verifiable details or documentation?" Then she hit send. She also left a note for Marcus, instructing him to do some background research on PierceTech, Brian, and any litigation records. By midday, no further information had come in. Marcus's preliminary search turned up little more than official press releases and a few enthusiastic blog posts about the rideshare concept. Nothing indicated illegal funding. Still, the lack of evidence didn't dispel her unease. Unable to shake the feeling, she called Neil. He picked up on the second ring, sounding cheerful. She agreed to review the investor deck and asked if there was anything she should know about financial sources. Neil seemed puzzled by the question, saying that the main backer was a reputable venture fund with no known controversies. After work, she stared at the investor materials they'd sent over. Charts depicting market share projections, data privacy strategies, potential growth models. Everything looked above board, but she was aware that these documents could be polished to hide the truth. She decided to text Brian, keeping it simple. "Need to ask you something important." "Can we meet?" Her heart pounded as she hit send, wondering if she was risking their fragile rapport. He replied half an hour later, "Sure, tonight I'll be at the office until late." That evening, she arrived at the PierceTech building after most of the staff had gone. Only a few lights glowed in the open office area, and she found Brian alone in a glass-walled conference room, tapping away on a laptop. He looked up, concern etched in his features. She entered slowly, closed the door behind her. "Thanks for making time," she said softly. He nodded, closing his laptop. "Something tells me this isn't just about editing our investor pitch." She took a breath, meeting his gaze. "I received an anonymous tip claiming your funding is suspect, allegations about stolen code, and a silent partner who might be bankrolling this for the wrong reasons." A flicker of hurt crossed Brian's face. "You suspect me?" Gabriella's voice came out steadier than she felt. "I don't know what to think. I'm trying to verify facts. If there's something I need to know, I'd rather hear it from you." His eyes clouded with anger and disappointment. "We've been transparent with you. My team and I, we're not criminals." She didn't step back, though his frustration radiated in the small room. "I'm not accusing you, but I can't ignore it either." They stood there, tension thrumming between them. She had taken a step into a confrontation she'd hoped wouldn't be necessary. Her mind raced with conflicting emotions, loyalty, skepticism, empathy, fear. As the silence drew out, she realized that whether or not the tip was real, this moment would test whatever trust they'd begun to build. Gabriella leaned against the long conference table at PierceTech, her arms folded over a neat blazer, as Brian and Rachel ran through a list of upcoming milestones. The air felt charged, each person contributing ideas to address issues raised in recent team meetings. Neil stood at the whiteboard, sketching out potential marketing angles for the platform's beta launch. Just days had passed since Gabriella confronted Brian about the anonymous tip, and the tension between them was still palpable. Yet there they were, working side by side to tackle the next phase. Gabriella's investigations, combined with information from Marcus and her own gut feelings, led her to believe that the claims of shady funding were unfounded. Whoever had sent that tip appeared to have a personal vendetta or was trying to sabotage Pierce Tech's credibility. She noticed Brian occasionally glance her way, as if searching for reassurance that she no longer doubted him. She gave him a small nod, which he returned before diving into the next bullet point on the projector screen. Rachel turned from her laptop, pushing her glasses up. "We have a pilot test scheduled in 2 weeks. We'll need volunteer drivers in Manhattan to use the app in real time. That means ensuring the route optimization works, but also that the user interface is clear." Neil drew a quick diagram. "We already have a short list of drivers from a local association. The challenge is that many are used to other rideshare apps. They'll need incentives to try ours, especially if it's still in beta." Gabriella tapped her pen thoughtfully on the table. "You could highlight the safety features and the reduced commission. Drivers might be interested in a system that treats them fairly." Rachel nodded. "That's the plan. We'll run a mini campaign on social media, focusing on word of mouth among professional drivers." Gabriella felt a current of excitement ripple through her. Each day in this environment posed a new test, but also a sense of shared purpose. She'd never been so closely involved in a tech initiative before, yet it felt oddly similar to shaping a book manuscript, refining the rough edges, clarifying the message, making sure the final product resonated with its audience. The meeting wrapped up and the group dispersed. Brian lingered, gathering papers from the table. Gabriella hesitated, then approached him. "I wanted to thank you for your patience, especially after I confronted you with those allegations." "Drazzi, I just had to be sure." He glanced at her, his expression a mix of relief and lingering hurt. "I get it. You're cautious. So am I. Just remember we're on the same side." She nodded, swallowing the guilt that still flickered in her chest. "I know. I'm trying to be more open-minded." Outside the conference room, the hum of activity was intense. Developers huddled over laptops, while a group from the design team debated font sizes and color palettes. The tension from earlier days remained, but there was fresh momentum. Everything felt like a series of stepping stones leading to the pilot launch. Gabriella spent part of the afternoon interviewing a few potential drivers. She asked them about their experiences, what they hoped to see improved in rideshare apps, and how they felt about data privacy. One driver, a middle-aged woman named Rebecca, shared stories of late-night rides and safety concerns. Gabriella took careful notes, promising to relay the insights to Rachel's team. After finishing the interviews, Gabriella settled into a temporary workstation in a corner of the office. She revised sections of the marketing brief, adding language that underscored not just reliability, but also empathy, highlighting that this platform aimed to protect both passengers and drivers. She found herself unexpectedly proud of how the messaging was shaping up. Mid-evening, she realized she'd been at Pierce Tech longer than planned. She should have returned to Harp and Red to finalize an editorial proposal for an author. Sighing, she logged off the Pierce Tech network and headed for the elevator. In the lobby, she ran into Rachel, who was leaving at the same time. "Long day?" Rachel asked, offering a tired smile. Gabriella laughed softly. "Seems like it's always a long day here." They exited onto the street, where the lights of Manhattan glowed against the twilight sky. Rachel glanced at her phone. "I'm grabbing a quick bite if you want to join, unless you have plans." Gabriella hesitated. Ordinarily, she would have rushed home to catch up on reading manuscripts. But she nodded. "Sure, that sounds nice." They found a small noodle shop around the corner, tucked between a florist and a convenience store. The shop had bright red lanterns and limited seating, but the savory steam drifting through the door was impossible to resist. Once inside, they each ordered a bowl of miso ramen and sat at a cramped table. Between spoonfuls, Rachel spoke about her own journey, growing up in a working-class neighborhood, discovering a passion for coding in a local summer program, and eventually earning a scholarship to a top university. "I always felt like I had to prove something," she said, swirling noodles in her bowl, "especially being a woman in tech. It's better these days, but there's still plenty of bias. Brian's always had my back, though. He's one of the few who never questioned my ability." Gabriella listened, intrigued by how Rachel's story paralleled her own in some ways. She'd fought an uphill battle to climb the editorial ladder, facing doubts about whether a Latina from a modest background could thrive in publishing's upper echelons. Yet, here she was. They finished their meal, stepping back outside to the swirl of city lights. Gabriella parted ways with Rachel, feeling a small surge of hope. She sensed that while the pilot launch loomed like a looming exam, the team had begun to conquer small challenges every day: technical kinks, branding uncertainties, and trust issues. That night, back in her apartment, she curled up on her sofa with a handful of documents about the pilot program, determined to add her editorial skills where needed. She realized that with each little success, whether refining language in a brief or confirming a driver's participation, she was learning the art of stepping out of her comfort zone. And though the tension with Brian still lingered, she felt herself growing closer to understanding both his vision and her own capacity to adapt. Gabriella paced her apartment, phone pressed to her ear. Dolores's voice crackled through the line, full of concern. "You sound exhausted, Mija. Are you sleeping enough? Eating well?" She stopped near the window. Outside, Manhattan's skyline glimmered in the early evening light. "I'm okay, Mama. Just juggling a lot," she answered, trying to sound upbeat. "There's a big project at the tech company I mentioned, and I'm still managing my editorial responsibilities." Dolores sighed softly. "You always push yourself so hard. Life isn't just about checking boxes or meeting goals. You remember that, right?" Gabriella let her mother's words sink in, memories flickering of how she'd studied relentlessly to get scholarships, determined never to let circumstances limit her. "I do, and I'm trying to balance things better." They ended the call with affectionate goodbyes, and Gabriella felt a pang of guilt. She had promised to visit Miami months ago, but the trip kept getting delayed by work. She set her phone aside, telling herself she'd book a flight soon. At the office the next day, she found a small package on her desk. Inside was a commemorative pen from her father, along with a terse note, "Thinking of you." She froze, the memories of his departure surfacing. She rarely talked about him, but she recalled how his sudden exit had shaped her fierce independence and deep-seated fear of betrayal. She slipped the note into her purse, deciding not to dwell on it. Mid-morning, she headed to Pierce Tech for a status update on the pilot program. The atmosphere was tense. Rachel looked frazzled, her hair pulled back in a haphazard ponytail. Developers hurried around, referencing multiple bug reports. Something had gone wrong in last night's test environment. Neil caught Gabriella by the elbow as she walked in. "We had a glitch that erased some driver feedback data," he explained, voice pitched low. "It's not catastrophic, but it's bad timing. We need that data to refine the interface before the pilot." She offered a concerned nod. "Can I help?" He led her to a conference room where Brian, Rachel, and a few others were poring over code on a projector screen. The mood was somber, frustration etched on everyone's faces. Rachel explained that a small encryption error had caused the data to store improperly, rendering it unusable. Brian ran a hand through his hair, looking more tired than Gabriella had ever seen him. We can ask the test drivers to redo their feedback, but that'll cause a delay. Our timeline is already tight." A silence settled. Then Gabriella spoke. "Maybe we don't need them to redo all of it. If some of the logs are partially intact, we can salvage what's there. Could we run a partial analysis that focuses on the biggest usability complaints first?" Rachel seemed to brighten. "That's not a bad idea. I'll look at the backups to see what's recoverable. Even if we only get 30% of the data, it might point us toward the major issues." Brian glanced at Gabriella with a grateful look. "Let's do that. It's better than starting from scratch." In the scramble that followed, Gabriella jumped in, scanning spreadsheets and matching them to time-stamped logs. Developers tried to reconstruct the incomplete data, while Rachel patched the encryption flaw. By late afternoon, they had retrieved enough to identify the most pressing user interface problems. It was a small victory, but a pivotal one. After hours of crisis management, the team dispersed. Gabriella found Brian alone in his glass-walled office, leaning against the desk. She slipped in and closed the door gently. "You pulled us out of the fire today," he said, voice subdued but appreciative. She waved it off. "I just suggested a workaround." Rachel and the others did the heavy lifting. He studied her, a mix of respect and something more intangible in his expression. "It's not just that. You've been bridging gaps here between the tech side, the communication side. I'm not sure we would have rebounded so smoothly without you." A flutter of warmth spread in Gabriella's chest, but she kept her demeanor steady. "I'm happy to help. I guess all those editorial deadlines trained me for crisis management," Brian offered a half-smile. "So, why do I still sense some hesitation?" She exhaled, setting her bag down. "I'm wrestling with something personal. My father reached out recently, and it stirred up old wounds. I promised myself I'd never let anyone's disappearance or betrayal catch me off guard again. But I realize I can't predict everything." His gaze softened. "I know what it's like to carry old baggage. I lost my mom a few years back. She was one of my biggest supporters, and for a while, I felt alone in this entire venture." They stood in silence, each acknowledging unspoken burdens. Outside, the hustle of tech employees continued. Inside that office, a subtle closeness grew. She sensed that her fear of betrayal was holding her back in more ways than one, both personally and professionally. A knock interrupted them. Rachel peered in, apologetic for intruding, but saying they had new log files to review. Brian nodded, thanking her. As Gabriella turned to leave, she caught his eye again. Though neither spoke, the moment hinted at an unspoken bond. Her conflicting emotions raged beneath her calm facade, uncertain if she could let her walls down when so much was at stake. A week later, tensions at Pierce Tech reached a boiling point. The pilot program was days away from launching, and all seemed poised for success, until a sudden barrage of critical press arrived. Major tech blogs ran sensational headlines about hidden investors and potential privacy vulnerabilities in the upcoming rideshare app. Though the articles were light on evidence, they spread like wildfire. Gabriella entered the office that morning to find the atmosphere charged with urgency. Neil paced near the reception area, phone in hand, while Rachel stormed around, lamenting the unfair assumptions made by the media. Brian was sequestered in a closed-door meeting with the legal team. She caught snippets of heated conversations, phrases like brand damage, investor panic, and PR nightmare. It was the worst possible time for such a scandal, true or not. Gabriella's heart pounded. She recalled the anonymous tip from before. Could this flurry of negative articles be connected to that? She found Rachel near the coffee station, clutching a mug with both hands. Her usual calm was nowhere in sight. "I don't know who's behind these allegations," she said, voice trembling with frustration. "We've done everything right, as far as I can tell." Gabriella placed a supportive hand on her shoulder. The truth will come out, but right now, we need damage control. Has the PR team made any official statement? Rachel nodded. They released a response, but the blogs are doubling down, saying we're avoiding specifics. And some of our prospective drivers are pulling out of the pilot, afraid of backlash. A fresh wave of dismay hit Gabriella. The pilot was already stretched thin. Without enough drivers, the program couldn't gather the data needed for a successful launch. I'll check with Brian, she said. Maybe there's a way to reassure everyone. Heading toward Brian's office, she passed clusters of employees hunched over their desks. Some were reading the damaging articles, others feverishly typing responses. The usually positive energy felt stifled by uncertainty. Inside Brian's office, she found him and Neil in the middle of a hushed exchange. Brian's jaw tightened as he scanned a website on his tablet. He glanced up when he saw Gabriella. They're citing a confidential source within Pierce Tech, he said, voice laced with betrayal, which means someone on the inside might be feeding them half-truths. Neil added, we're bleeding credibility fast. If we can't nip this in the bud, the pilot won't just be delayed, it might collapse. Gabriella's thoughts whirled. The obstacle felt enormous, larger than anything they'd faced so far. She took a moment to steady herself, remembering her own editorial background. We should create a clear, transparent Q&A about your funding, your privacy protocols, everything. Lay it all out. Brian set aside the tablet. We've tried to do that in our PR statement, but maybe we need a more direct approach. Social media, interviews, something that shows we have nothing to hide. Neil leaned against the wall, arms crossed. We also have to find the leak. If there's a rogue employee stirring up trouble, they could sabotage us further. The weight of the situation pressed down. Gabriella recalled how personal the project had become for many at Pierce Tech. The stakes weren't just about money or corporate reputation. They were about the trust built between team members. She exhaled slowly. Let's tackle this from two angles. An internal review to find the source, and an external campaign that clarifies your ethics. I can help craft the messaging. They agreed on a plan. Neil would coordinate with PR to schedule a roundtable with reputable journalists, while Brian would personally address the driver community, offering direct conversations to allay fears. Gabriella would draft a straightforward set of documents outlining funding sources, corporate structure, and how user data would be secured. Within hours, she was at a workstation, typing up a detailed FAQ. She drew on everything she'd observed, from Pierce Tech's coding sessions to private chats with Brian and Rachel about the company's core values. As the day wore on, she felt the tension building in her own chest, an anxiety that they might be too late. Toward evening, Brian joined her, scanning the near-finished document on her screen. He looked drained, but mustered a small smile. This is exactly what we need. Straight facts, no fluff. Thank you. She gave him a tight nod. Let's hope it's enough to counter the rumors. Just then, an abrupt power outage struck the floor. Lights flickered, and the computers went dark. Startled gasps arose around the office. A backup generator kicked in seconds later, but the glitch disrupted half the network for a good 20 minutes, costing precious time. Gabriella's heart sank. It felt like the universe was throwing every possible hurdle at them. She helped reboot the systems alongside frantic IT specialists. When the screens finally blinked back to life, she noticed that her document had auto-saved. Thankfully, most of it was intact. Looking around, she saw the worry etched on every face. This was their biggest challenge yet, coming at the worst possible moment. If they couldn't neutralize the scandal, the pilot, possibly the entire platform, would fail. Knowing how hard everyone had worked, Gabriella felt a surge of determination. She understood, in a way she hadn't before, that this wasn't just Brian's battle. It was hers, too. The next morning, Gabriella arrived early at Pierce Tech, determined to see the plan through. The building's lobby felt quieter than usual, as if the crisis had drained people's usual energy. She spotted Rachel near the elevator, wearing dark circles under her eyes, but a resolute expression on her face. They rode up to the office in silence, each lost in their thoughts. Once the elevator opened, Gabriella headed straight for the makeshift war room that Brian and Neil had set up. Charts lined the walls, listing media outlets, potential influencers, and a timeline for upcoming statements. Her FAQ document had already been circulated among mid-level managers, and it seemed to be making waves. A handful of new articles appeared online, referencing Pierce Tech's transparency initiatives. Some commentators questioned whether the rumors of shady funding might be overblown. Neil, hunched over a laptop at a cluttered table, looked up as she entered. "Hey, good news! A few respected tech journalists are covering our Q&A in a more balanced way. They're highlighting the app's features and how your FAQ tackles privacy head-on." Gabriella allowed herself a moment to breathe. "That's great. Maybe we can turn the narrative around." Just then, Brian walked in, a phone pressed to his ear. He gestured for silence as he finished the call. "Yes, we appreciate your willingness to meet." "Absolutely. We'll be there." He hung up, a flicker of relief crossing his face. That was one of our biggest potential investors. They still have questions, but they're open to a face-to-face discussion. A few days ago, they were ready to back out. Rachel joined them, a stack of papers in her arms. "I got an email from 4 drivers who had previously backed out. They're willing to give the pilot a shot after reading the new info. And guess what? Rebecca is helping us do outreach. She's telling other drivers that we're legitimate." An undercurrent of hope spread through the room. They weren't out of the woods, but each small victory felt like a step toward reclaiming their momentum. Gabriella and the others dove back into work, refining press releases and preparing bullet points for the investor meeting. Late in the afternoon, a message arrived in Gabriella's inbox from her anonymous tipster. It read, "Not bad, but there's still more to uncover. Keep your eyes open." She felt a chill at the vague threat, but decided to forward it to Brian and Neil, who in turn passed it to the legal team. If someone was trying to sabotage them, at least they would be on alert. By nightfall, the team gathered in the lounge area for a quick check-in. The overhead lights cast a soft glow over their exhausted faces. Some slumped on couches, others perched on stools. Brian stood near a counter, leaning on it for support, yet projecting a calm focus. He offered a tight smile. "We've managed to stabilize the situation, at least for now. We've got journalists who trust us, a group of drivers who believe in us again, and an investor who's willing to talk. It's not the grand slam we hoped for, but it's a start." Neil lifted a soda can in a mock toast. "To everyone here, let's keep pushing." A smattering of weary smiles and nods followed. Gabriella quietly marveled at how, just a day ago, it seemed everything was crashing down. Now, they had a fighting chance. As people filed out, Gabriella lingered, flipping through her notes on the FAQ. Brian approached her, voice soft. "You should get some rest." "We all should." She glanced up, noticing the way his shoulders slumped from fatigue. "I will. But first, thank you for trusting me to do what I do best." "I wasn't sure if you'd be open to that level of transparency, especially after all the rumors." He managed a wry grin. "I figured if we have nothing to hide, we might as well show it. Besides, you've proven you're willing to fight for what's right, not just chase a headline." A small warmth flickered in her chest. Their relationship, once marked by awkward mishaps and mutual wariness, had grown into a partnership based on respect. She thought about how the anonymous tipster's words still haunted her, but for now, she chose to focus on the present. She packed her documents and walked with Brian to the elevator. Outside, the city lights illuminated the windows, reflecting off passing cars. Though they spoke little, she sensed a closeness forming. The chaos of the day faded, leaving behind the steady promise of a partial triumph. It was an overcast morning as Gabriella arrived at a rented auditorium on the outskirts of Midtown. A Pierce Tech banner hung over the entrance, and a small cluster of drivers and curious onlookers gathered inside the lobby. This event was a final pre-pilot rally, aimed at energizing drivers and showing potential backers that the platform was robust and trustworthy. Gabriella took a seat in the front row with Rachel and Neil. She scanned the small stage, set up near the front, which held a podium and a large screen displaying the Pierce Tech logo. Brian was poised at the podium, going over his notes. She could tell from his rigid posture that he felt the weight of this gathering. People found their seats, and Brian began with a short introduction. He spoke about the origin of the idea, how he believed that technology could foster a safer, cleaner, and more efficient commute. He outlined the main features of the app, addressing data privacy with the direct, candid tone Gabriella had helped craft. She watched the crowd's reaction, seeing nods of approval and a few skeptical frowns. Partway through, he invited real drivers to share their perspectives. Rebecca, the driver who had rejoined the pilot after initial doubts, stepped up. She praised the app's focus on driver safety, recounting a frightening late-night incident from a previous job. "Knowing Pierce Tech's platform has built-in emergency alerts makes me feel I'm not alone out there," she said. Applause broke out, and Gabriella felt a surge of optimism. A moment later, Rachel presented a short demo of the interface, showing how new features had been integrated based on feedback from earlier tests. The crowd murmured in approval, seemingly impressed, but just as the energy in the room swelled, an agitated voice erupted from the back. "What about those reports that your funding isn't clean, or that you're stealing code from a competitor? Is Pierce Tech just going to ignore those allegations?" All heads turned. A man in a rumpled blazer stood, waving a printout of a tabloid-style article. Brian's expression tightened, though he kept his tone polite. "We've addressed those rumors in our Q&A documents, and we're fully transparent about our investors. As for the code theft, that's completely false. We have full documentation of our development history." The man barked a laugh. "So you say? Sounds convenient?" The tension in the auditorium rose palpably, a ripple of anxiety weaving through the attendees. Gabriella felt her pulse quicken. She recognized the sneering cynicism. This was the kind of public confrontation that could unravel all their hard work. Maintaining composure, Brian invited the man to view the relevant documents after the event, emphasizing they were open for scrutiny. But the interruption cast a shadow over the rest of the presentation. The crowd seemed unsettled, glancing at the man's printed article. Neil leaned toward Gabriella, whispering, "He's not on our list of invitees, might be a plant from a competitor, or the tipster himself." Gabriella stiffened. She remembered the anonymous emails and the sabotage attempts. It felt like a final test, pushing them to the edge of their resolve. Once Brian concluded his main talk, a Q&A session followed. The tension in the air lingered, but many attendees asked constructive questions about safety features, driver earnings, or the user interface. Gabriella noticed some drivers discreetly exchanging relieved looks after hearing direct answers. Slowly, the atmosphere lifted as the audience focused on the app's tangible benefits rather than rumors. When the session ended, people mingled in the lobby, sipping coffee and forming small discussion circles. Gabriella hovered near Brian, who looked drained but determined as he answered the man in the rumpled blazer one last time. The man sneered, muttered something about digging deeper, and stormed out. Brian exhaled. "That could have gone worse," he said under his breath, turning to Gabriella. She nodded, heart still pounding. "I think, overall, the event was a success. Drivers seemed receptive." Neil joined them, taking off his ID badge. "We definitely have some skeptics, but the fact that we openly addressed concerns should help. The next step is to prove the app works in the real world." Rachel walked over, wearing a cautiously optimistic smile. "Despite the drama, a few more drivers just signed up for the pilot. That's a good sign." Relief coursed through Gabriella. Their focus now turned to the upcoming real-world pilot, arguably the ultimate challenge. If they could show consistent reliability, fair driver treatment, and robust privacy safeguards, they might finally shake off the shadows of rumor. Yet, as they gathered their materials and prepared to leave, she couldn't escape the feeling that the confrontation with the man in the blazer was just the beginning of a larger storm. Pierce Tech had endured weeks of stress, but an outright sabotage attempt was still possible. She looked at Brian, who offered a tight smile of encouragement. Outside, the sky remained overcast, hinting at potential rain. Gabriella and Brian walked side by side to their respective cars. Before parting ways, she lightly touched his arm. "We'll get through this," she said. "We're almost there." He nodded, eyes lingering on her with a blend of gratitude and resolve. "I believe that. Let's make sure this pilot proves them all wrong." She watched him go, that flicker of unspoken understanding passing between them once more. There was no denying the pilot launch would be the real crucible, where illusions, if any, would be shattered, and where all their efforts would either crystallize into success or dissolve into failure. On a crisp, clear morning, just a few days after the tense auditorium gathering, Gabriella stood outside a Manhattan parking garage, her breath clouding the cold air. A half-dozen drivers, each with a Pierce Tech decal on their car windows, were busy installing the updated app on their phones. This was the official start of the pilot program, where all the promises Brian and his team had made would be tested on real streets with real passengers. Rachel greeted Gabriella by the garage entrance, wearing a purple scarf and clutching a tablet loaded with tracking software. "Looks like everyone's almost set," she said, tapping through menus. "We'll monitor the rides in real time, collecting feedback tonight and over the next week. If all goes well, we'll expand to other boroughs." Gabriella nodded, glancing around. She recognized Rebecca among the drivers, along with a few other individuals she'd interviewed. Each one appeared both excited and wary, eager to try the new system, but mindful of the controversy that had dogged Pierce Tech in recent weeks. Several local reporters stood off to the side, cameras at the ready, hoping for a headline, good or bad. She spotted Brian further inside the garage, near a sedan that was being fitted with a special dashboard device. He was talking quietly with Neil, arms folded across his chest. Even from a distance, she could see tension in his posture, as if the weight of the entire venture pressed on his shoulders. She made her way over. "Big day," she said softly, offering a small smile. He nodded, exhaling a plume of breath into the chilly air. "It is, and it's only the first step. Even if this goes perfectly, we'll still have months of fine-tuning before a full launch." Neil shifted, checking his phone. "We've got coverage lined up from a couple of tech news sites. They're cautiously optimistic, but won't hesitate to crucify us if they smell failure." Gabriella understood. The pilot had to function smoothly, no crashes, minimal glitches, and positive user experiences. Otherwise, the media would latch onto every misstep. "I've shared the driver stories and the new FAQ with them," she said. "Try to put a human face on what you're doing here." Brian offered her a grateful glance. "Thank you. Let's hope it's enough." With everything set, Rachel called the drivers together for a final pep talk. She covered basic troubleshooting steps, reminded them of the safety features, and assured them the Pierce Tech team would be on standby around the clock. The drivers started their engines, one by one, each car pulling out of the garage into the bustling Manhattan streets to pick up real passengers via the new platform. Gabriella felt her heart thud as the first car disappeared into traffic. In one sense, her role was minimal now. She wasn't a coder or an investor, but she'd become part of the lifeblood of this operation, pouring her time and credibility into helping Pierce Tech get here. She wanted it to succeed, not just for Brian, but for the entire team that had sacrificed so much. They set up a temporary command center in a small office a few blocks away, screens displaying real-time maps. Each driver's progress was tracked. Trip requests, route optimizations, arrival times. Gabriella joined Brian, Rachel, Neil, and a handful of developers around the largest monitor. "All 6 are active," Rachel announced, pointing at a digital map of Manhattan dotted with moving icons. "First passenger just got picked up near 53rd Street. Brian, hovering behind her, let out a slow breath. "And so it begins." An hour in, the first feedback trickled through. A driver reported confusion about the payment interface. Another noted that a passenger had praised the smoother navigation. Gabriella typed notes as the developers logged each comment. The tension in the room was palpable. Everyone was on edge, waiting for a major crash or a triumphant wave of success. By midday, local journalists began to post short pieces. Pierce Tech's pilot goes live. Early results mixed, but promising. One article mentioned no reported app errors yet. Another pointed out the streamlined design. Gabriella scanned each headline, feeling a cautious relief. Late in the afternoon, a hiccup emerged. One driver's app froze mid-route, forcing the passenger to switch to another service. It wasn't catastrophic, but it was still a blemish on the day's record. Rachel and a developer scrambled to debug the issue, updating the system within the hour. Gabriella caught Brian staring at the map with a determined set to his jaw. "We can't afford too many of those glitches," he muttered, "not while the press is watching." She gently placed a hand on his arm. "We knew there'd be hiccups. It's a pilot. The important thing is how fast you fix them." He looked at her, the edges of tension in his eyes softening. "Thank you for reminding me. Sometimes I forget that perfection on day one is impossible." As the sun began to set, the pilot's first full day approached its end. Drivers reported back with final tallies, mostly successful trips, a few awkward moments with the app's interface, and one passenger who insisted it was better than any other rideshare they'd used. That small piece of praise lifted the spirits of the entire room. Gabriella helped compile a preliminary report, which Rachel would compare with user survey data overnight. Despite the nerves and the one glitch, the pilot's opening act seemed to pass without major disaster. Around 8 in the evening, Brian finally unclenched his jaw, letting out a laugh of relief with Neil and Rachel. Small clusters of team members exchanged tired high fives. Gabriella exhaled, leaning back in her chair. She glanced at Brian, who caught her eye across the room. He stepped over, extending his hand in a half-joking handshake. She took it, both smiling. For a moment, the gravity of the day dissolved into a shared sense of accomplishment. That same evening, Gabriella left Pierce Tech's temporary command center with a sense of cautious satisfaction. She wandered a few blocks under the neon lights and caught the subway toward her apartment. The train rattled beneath the city, and she found herself recalling every milestone from the past few weeks, stepping into Brian's car by mistake. Her initial skepticism, the rumors that threatened to topple Pierce Tech, and this day's test that, while not perfect, had gone far better than many would have expected. She arrived home to find her mailbox filled with the usual flyers and bills, but one envelope stood out, a Miami postmark. Her mother had sent her a card with a short letter. Inside, Dolores asked if Gabriella could visit for a long weekend, hinting that life wasn't all about deadlines. There was a note in the margin about her father having tried to reach out again, urging Gabriella to consider forgiving him. She sighed, sliding the envelope onto her coffee table. Ever since the pen and note arrived from him, she'd pushed thoughts of her father aside. She resented the way he vanished when she was a teen, leaving her to clean up the pieces of a broken household. Yet a part of her wondered if carrying that anger had also hurt her, influencing how tightly she tried to control every aspect of her own life. In the morning, her mind remained heavy with family memories as she prepared for a meeting at Harp and Red. She arrived at her office to find the editorial team in mild chaos. A high-profile author had delivered a rushed manuscript, and they needed Gabriella's expertise to whip it into shape before a press event. She spent hours dissecting the text, providing pointed feedback. Late afternoon found her heading back to the Pierce Tech office. The pilot continued for a second day, and she wanted to see the data. As she entered, Rachel waved her over to a large monitor displaying lines of code and a steady flow of incoming feedback. "Good news," Rachel said, her voice bright. "We fixed the glitch from yesterday, and so far, no repeat problems." Gabriella scanned the stats. Trip completions were up, ratings hovered around 4 and 5 stars, and the commentary from both drivers and passengers looked encouraging. She spotted a few gripes about minor interface quirks, but nothing catastrophic. "That's fantastic," she replied, feeling a genuine swell of pride. "Seems like we're winning people over, one ride at a time." From behind, Brian's voice chimed in. "Any sign of the sabotage we feared?" Rachel and Gabriella shook their heads. "Not yet," Rachel answered, then added wryly, "but I'm not letting my guard down." They regrouped in a side office, a smaller and quieter space where Neil joined them via video call. He had stepped out to speak with a group of investors, so his face on the screen carried an excited undertone. "Investors are intrigued by these early results," he said, adjusting his tie. "No official commitments yet, but the vibe is a lot less hostile than before." A round of pleased nods went through the group. Brian rubbed a hand over his beard, which had grown a little more pronounced in recent days. "Still," he cautioned, "we're not home free. We have at least a week of pilot testing, and we need consistent performance. One big scandal or major app failure, and it all collapses." Gabriella didn't miss the worry lines on his forehead or the slight tremor in his hand when he picked up a pen. She sensed how much he'd sacrificed for this project. Rumors from co-workers mentioned he'd invested large chunks of his own personal fortune. If Pierce Tech collapsed, it wouldn't just be a business setback, it would be a personal catastrophe. She remembered her mother's words about life not being all about deadlines and goals. Brian seemed to live by deadlines and goals too, yet she wondered if he had anyone reminding him to breathe. After Neil signed off, Brian and Gabriella lingered in the small office. She glanced at him, noticing the circles under his eyes. "Are you sleeping at all?" He let out a humorless chuckle. "Not much. Maybe I can rest when this pilot is officially declared a success." "Your health matters," she said quietly. "Pierce Tech can't stand if its leader collapses." He nodded, a rueful smile touching his face. "I'll keep that in mind." Then he looked at her, a softened glance that felt intimate in the fluorescent glow. "And what about you? Balancing an editorial career and being an unofficial advisor to a tech startup can't be easy." She shrugged lightly. "I'm adjusting. But I do need to figure out other parts of my life." She thought about her mother and father, the unresolved knots in her personal history. "Sometimes I wonder if all this focus on work is my way of avoiding bigger issues." He studied her, taking in the uncertainty in her voice. "You know," he said gently, "I didn't just invite you to Pierce Tech for editorial expertise. There was something about your honesty, your determination, that I admired. If you need someone to lean on—" He trailed off, letting the offer linger. A warmth blossomed in her chest, mixed with apprehension. She appreciated his sincerity, but the prospect of becoming emotionally entangled with him when everything was so precarious made her hesitant. Still, she couldn't deny the growing closeness between them. Outside, they heard Rachel call their names, urging them to check the latest driver feedback. With a final exchange of glances, they stepped back into the fray, where the fate of Pierce Tech teetered on the edge of success. The pilot program advanced steadily over the following days. Each morning, Gabriella visited Pierce Tech to help assess new feedback and refine any messaging that Neil and the marketing team needed. In the evenings, she returned to Harp and Reed, catching up on the manuscripts piling up on her desk. The tight schedule left her barely enough time to breathe, but she noticed a shift in her mindset. No longer was she the meticulously controlled editor who dismissed anything outside her planned routine. Her interactions with Pierce Tech had nudged her toward bolder choices, like speaking up in tense meetings or assisting with driver outreach. She felt more present, more willing to let events unfold without micromanaging every detail. One afternoon, she encountered Rachel in the hallway, looking victorious. "We just hit the 100th successful ride without a single crash or freeze," Rachel said, holding up her phone as if it were a trophy. "That's a milestone, Gabriella." They exchanged excited grins, and Gabriella decided to share some news of her own. "I've been thinking about scheduling a trip to Miami," she admitted. "I realized I keep putting it off, and I owe my mom a proper visit." Rachel nodded, sincerity in her eyes. "You should. Life's too short to drift apart from family if there's still a chance to connect." Later that day, Brian called an impromptu team huddle, where Rachel, Neil, and Gabriella joined him around a small conference table. He projected a screen showing metrics: driver satisfaction, passenger wait times, overall trip efficiency. The numbers had improved every single day of the pilot. "It's remarkable," Brian stated, pride tinging his voice. "We still have minor hiccups, but nothing to derail us. Investors are starting to see we're serious. They're scheduling in-person demos next week." Neil flashed a thumbs up. "The rumor mills also died down. Whoever tried to sabotage us hasn't produced any new dirt." Gabriella breathed a sigh of relief. Yet she recalled the cryptic messages from the tipster. A small part of her worried about hidden landmines, but at least for now, they had momentum in their favor. Rachel suggested they celebrate the pilot's midpoint success. "How about we grab dinner tonight, get the team together, blow off some steam?" Everyone agreed. They chose a laid-back grill near the Hudson River, an industrial chic spot with exposed brick walls and a view of passing ferries. By the time Gabriella arrived, Brian, Rachel, and several developers were already there, sipping beverages and swapping inside jokes. The tension of the past weeks seemed to melt in the laughter that echoed among them. Over plates of sizzling food, stories emerged. Rachel recounted the first time she ever coded a simple game in high school. Neil described leaving a stable marketing job to join Pierce Tech, convinced they were on the verge of a breakthrough. Others chimed in with similar leaps of faith. Gabriella found herself smiling at their passion. It reminded her of her early days in publishing, when every manuscript felt like a grand adventure. Over time, she'd hardened, learning to be skeptical of lofty claims. But here, she rediscovered a spark of optimism, appreciating how an ambitious project could unite people in meaningful ways. Halfway through the meal, Brian leaned closer to Gabriella. "You're quiet. Everything okay?" She set down her fork. "I'm just reflecting on how much has changed," she admitted. "I never thought I'd be so invested in a tech startup. My job was to critique, not to jump in and help build." He met her gaze with a subtle warmth. "You still critique," he teased gently, just with a different intent. Gabriella felt a soft flutter in her chest. "I suppose that's true." She noticed how the conversation around them faded into the background, as if the bustling restaurant dissolved for a moment. "I'm happy, though, or at least happier than I've been in a long time." Brian studied her with quiet admiration. "I can see that. You're more relaxed, more open." He paused, as though weighing what to say next. "You know, I never expected to meet someone like you the way I did, accidentally. But I'm grateful for it." A faint blush crept up her neck. "Strange how one wrong step can lead to something right," she said, thinking back to that fateful night she entered the wrong car. Their moment was interrupted by Rachel calling for everyone's attention. She raised her glass and proposed a toast to the halfway mark and the hope that the second half is even smoother. The table erupted in cheers and clinking glasses. Brian and Gabriella joined in, though their eyes lingered on each other. Later, when the group disbanded, Gabriella walked out onto the sidewalk, where a light wind carried the scent of the river. She felt a subtle sense of transformation, like she'd stepped through an invisible threshold. She was no longer merely a critical bystander. She was part of a team, and part of a budding relationship with the man who'd once been an anonymous driver. And there was more yet to come. The final confrontation with any lingering challenges, the meeting with investors, and her own personal decision about facing her past. She inhaled the night air, letting the tension ease from her shoulders, resolved to keep moving forward. 3 days later, Gabriella waited in the Pierce Tech lobby for a gathering of potential investors to arrive. These individuals were high-profile venture capitalists, some of whom had expressed reservations amid the earlier rumors. Brian intended to give them an inside look at the pilot's progress, hoping to secure the final funding needed for a broader launch. Rachel was stationed at a demonstration table, busy setting up a live video feed of a driver currently on a trip downtown. Neil stood beside her, adjusting large printouts of performance data. Gabriella had contributed by drafting a succinct yet compelling summary of the pilot's success so far. The summary, paired with visuals, would hopefully convince even the most skeptical audience. Brian stepped out of his office, checking his watch. He wore a tailored navy suit, and though he looked every inch the confident CEO, Gabriella caught the slight tension in his shoulders. She approached him quietly. "Big day, huh?" He nodded, straightening his jacket lapel. "We need at least one major investor to commit, or we risk stalling out after the pilot. Our existing resources won't cover a full-scale launch." Gabriella offered a firm smile. "You have a great team, real results, and a compelling story. Let those things shine." Moments later, a group of 5 investors walked in, each dressed in an air of understated wealth. Italian leather shoes, discreet designer handbags. Greetings were exchanged, business cards passed around. Brian led them into a conference room with floor-to-ceiling windows, showcasing a partial view of the East River. The presentation unfolded smoothly. Rachel demonstrated the driver interface. Neil explained the long-term market potential, and Gabriella briefly described the ethical stance Pierce Tech took by addressing privacy concerns head-on. Brian maintained a poised demeanor, answering tough questions about scaling strategies and revenue projections. Halfway through, one investor, a stern-looking older man with silver hair, folded his hands. "You talk a good game," he said, fixing Brian with a sharp gaze. "But I've heard whispers of ongoing disputes with a former partner. Why should we risk our capital if there's a potential lawsuit looming?" A tight silence ensued. Gabriella felt her stomach knot. Brian inhaled quietly. "We have no active legal disputes," he said steadily. "A disgruntled ex-supplier made false claims after leaving the project a year ago, but our internal documentation proves they had no ownership of the tech." The man arched an eyebrow. "How can we be sure no skeletons will appear if we run deeper due diligence?" Rachel pulled out a file, sliding it across the table. "These are the relevant contracts and departure agreements. You're free to review them." "We believe transparency is our strongest defense." Gabriella observed the man's skeptical expression gradually soften. He thumbed through a few pages, then placed the file back down. "All right," he said curtly. "I'll need my legal team to examine this further, but I appreciate the candor." A younger investor, a woman with a bright smile, chimed in. "In a saturated market, how do you plan to differentiate enough to beat the big competitors?" Neil brought up a slide on the projector. "One advantage is our unique driver-centric approach. Lower commission rates and robust safety measures will attract the best drivers, which in turn attracts loyal passengers. Think of it as a virtuous cycle." The woman nodded, clearly intrigued. As the Q&A continued, Gabriella sensed a cautious optimism in the room. The potential investors probed more about expansion timelines, corporate governance, and staff expertise. Each time, Brian or one of his team had a direct, well-researched response. After nearly 2 hours, the group concluded with polite handshakes. The stern older man offered a brief but telling remark, "I'm impressed by what I've seen. We'll be in touch soon." When the door finally closed, Brian exhaled audibly, a hint of relief shaping his face. Rachel punched the air in a small victory move. Neil let out a quiet chuckle, muttering, "I think we might have them." Gabriella felt a surge of pride, recalling her own contributions. Editing the presentation materials, honing the messaging about trust and transparency. This whole process felt like shepherding a manuscript toward publication, only the stakes were higher and the drama far more immediate. Brian caught her eye, stepping over. "We wouldn't have handled those questions half as smoothly if you hadn't pushed us to detail everything in the FAQ and investor briefing," he said, genuine gratitude in his tone. She shrugged, smiling. "You gave me plenty of material to work with, and all of it legitimate, which helps." He nodded, then glanced around the room at the triumphant team. In quieter words, he added, "After a final positive nod from them, we'll be just a few steps away from launching statewide or even beyond." Before Gabriella could respond, Neil called out, "We should celebrate, or at least get some fresh air. I'm starving." The group erupted in laughter, tension releasing. They decided on a quick lunch together at a nearby cafe. As they filtered out of the conference room, Brian placed a hand lightly on Gabriella's arm, holding her back for a moment. His gaze was warm, a mixture of relief and something more personal. "I mean it. You've changed the course of this company, and maybe mine too," he said softly. Her heart fluttered, recalling the many shared moments and unspoken confessions. "I'm glad I could help," she managed. "And there's still more to do, right?" He gave a slight nod. "We're almost at the finish line. Almost." Yet Gabriella sensed an undercurrent, both in the project and in her personal life. The biggest trials appeared behind them, but she couldn't shake the feeling that one last confrontation still loomed on the horizon, waiting to test everything they had built. It was a chilly Friday evening when Gabriella found herself in a crowded midtown cafe with Brian, Rachel, and a handful of Pierce Tech developers. They gathered around a table littered with laptops, half-empty coffee cups, and assorted printouts. The pilot was officially winding down. Having run successfully for nearly 2 weeks, they were cross-checking final statistics, user adoption rates, driver satisfaction scores, passenger ratings, technical stability, and more. If everything aligned, Monday morning would bring a formal press release announcing the pilot's completion and inviting broader investor participation. Excitement buzzed through the group, though there was a noticeable undercurrent of fatigue. Brian scrolled through data points on his screen. We've achieved a 97% trip completion rate with less than 1% serious error occurrences. That's phenomenal for a beta launch. Rachel grinned widely. It's way better than most rideshare startups at this stage. I'm going to compile an official report for the board. Gabriella sipped her coffee, checking her phone for messages. She noticed one from her mother. A simple text that read, "I miss you. Let's talk soon." An ache flared in Gabriella's chest, thinking about how she put off a trip to Miami yet again. She resolved to book a flight as soon as the press release was out. Just as the developers began to pack up, Brian's phone buzzed. He read a text with a deepening frown. "That can't be right," he murmured. Rachel peered over. "What is it?" "Rebecca. She says she just had a major app crash in the middle of a passenger trip, lost navigation entirely, and had to pull over." Gabriella set down her coffee. "First I've heard of it. Did it auto-report?" Brian shook his head, worry lining his face. "No, which is already odd. The system is designed to log any crash. She says it locked her out completely. She had to reboot her phone." A hush fell over the group. A single crash in itself might not be catastrophic, but the timing was awful, right at the final stretch, just before they planned to declare victory. "Let's see if we can recreate it," Rachel said, opening her laptop. They spent an hour trying to replicate the issue in test environments, but the code ran smoothly. No matter what they did, they couldn't trigger the same failure. Brian paced behind them, tension rippling across his brow. Could someone be meddling? The sabotage angle? Rachel grimaced. Possible, but we'd need more clues. Gabriella's phone buzzed again, this time a notification from her blog. She checked it absently, only to see a new anonymous comment. "I warned you there was more. The final blow is about to land." A chill swept through her. She showed Brian, whose expression darkened. He exhaled slowly. "All right, let's get back to the office. Pull up logs from every possible source. We can't let this overshadow everything we've accomplished." They hurriedly left the cafe, the developers trailing behind. Within half an hour, they'd gathered in a small war room at Pierce Tech, scouring system logs for any sign of foul play. Rachel finally found something, a fragment of unauthorized code injected into the system logs at the approximate time Rebecca reported the crash. It looked like a piece of malware designed to trigger intermittently, not an accidental bug. Brian clenched his fists. "So this is deliberate sabotage." Gabriella's heart pounded. The anonymous tipster's threats had been real, after all. They'd waited for the perfect moment to strike, hoping to unleash a damaging crash just as Pierce Tech prepared to declare success. Rachel and a developer immediately began isolating the malware's code signature, working to block and remove it from the system. "We can patch this, but the question is how it got in," Rachel said, typing furiously. A cold knot formed in Gabriella's stomach. Someone inside must have installed it. Or maybe they found a vulnerability in the server firewall. Brian nodded grimly. "We need to confirm that. If it's an inside job, then we have a serious breach of trust on top of a technical crisis." Within another hour, Rachel managed to cleanse the active system of the malicious code. She recommended a full security review, but that would take more time. Brian, however, wanted immediate answers. He contacted the head of IT to run an internal audit, focusing on employee access logs. Meanwhile, Gabriella checked her watch. Well past midnight. She couldn't leave now, not when everything hung in the balance. The team pressed on, battling fatigue with coffee and sheer willpower. By 2 a.m., a partial breakthrough emerged. The malware had come through a remote entry key assigned to a former consultant who left Pierce Tech months earlier. That same individual had recently been seen spreading rumors about the app's alleged flaws. "This is it," Brian said softly, reading the findings. "We've found our culprit." A wave of relief and anger coursed through Gabriella. Relief, because they finally had proof of deliberate sabotage. Anger, because the betrayal stung. The ex-consultant had likely harbored resentment and seized the moment to insert code that would undermine the pilot's credibility. They decided to share the discovery with their PR and legal teams first thing in the morning. For now, the immediate crisis seemed contained. Rachel reported that Rebecca's phone was back online and the system functioned normally. Yet Brian remained uneasy, pacing in the dimly lit office. Gabriella moved close, resting a hand on his arm. "We found the sabotage. We fixed it. Tomorrow we'll secure everything before the final pilot results go public." He stopped pacing, eyes heavy with fatigue and relief. "Thank you," he murmured, voice tinged with gratitude and vulnerability. "This could have sunk us." Her heart softened at the sight of him, exhausted but determined. "It still might, if the media runs the crash story before we can clarify. But one sabotage attempt doesn't erase 2 weeks of good data. We'll prove that." Brian exhaled, rubbing his eyes. "Right, we just can't afford to let fear stop us now." In the dim glow of the overhead lights, they stood quietly, each carrying the weight of the final hurdle. With the patched code and the culprit identified, they were poised to announce the pilot's success. The true test lay in how quickly they could address this last-minute sabotage, and whether the world would believe their story of resilience over betrayal. Gabriella stepped out of the Pierce Tech building into a cool, overcast morning, hugging her trench coat closer around her shoulders. The pilot had officially ended the day before, and the final press release had gone out without further incidents. Despite the lingering memory of the sabotage attempt, the overall reaction from media and investors was cautiously optimistic. It should have been a moment of elation for her, yet she felt strangely subdued. She walked 2 blocks to a small bakery she'd frequented in her early days in Manhattan. Its warm glow stood in welcome contrast to the grey city streets. Pushing open the door, she inhaled the aroma of freshly baked bread and cinnamon rolls. She hadn't realized how hungry she was. Over a cup of coffee, she scrolled through new headlines on her phone. Most outlets praised Pierce Tech's transparent response to the sabotage and applauded the team's determination. A few critics remained suspicious, but Gabriella suspected time and consistent performance would quiet them. Yet beneath her pride in the project lay an unshakable vulnerability. She thought about the anonymous tipster's threats, the ex-consultant's betrayal, and even her own father's attempt to reconnect. So much of her energy had gone into building walls to protect herself, both personally and professionally. Now, those walls felt more like barriers she might no longer want. Her phone buzzed with a call from Dolores. She paused before answering, realizing how few details she had shared with her mother about the project's intensity. "Mama," she greeted, forcing a gentle tone. "Gabriella, I saw some news about this tech company you've been working with," Dolores said, her warm voice tinged with excitement. "Are you all right, mija? You sounded so tired last time we spoke." Gabriella stared at a half-finished croissant, wishing she could assure her mother that everything was simple and perfect. I'm all right. The pilot concluded yesterday, so things should calm down." Her mother sighed in relief. "Then maybe you can fly down to Miami soon. It's been too long." Gabriella hesitated. She had delayed this visit more times than she cared to admit, but there was no looming crisis at Pierce Tech now. At least not one that required her immediate presence. "I'll see if I can manage," she said. "I promise, Mama, I'm trying." They ended the call amicably, but a sense of unease lingered. She thought of the small package from her father she'd tucked away in her apartment. Perhaps it was time to confront the fractured pieces of her past. Later that afternoon, she stopped by Harper Reed to catch up on her editorial backlog. Marcus greeted her with a stack of new manuscripts, each with a yellow sticky note of instructions. "I tried to filter out the junk, but you might still find a couple that are hopeless," he joked, sliding them onto her desk. She thanked him, feeling a pang of gratitude for his support and loyalty. Sitting at her chair, she rifled through the papers, making quick notes on potential leads and summarizing the rest for the slush pile. It felt familiar, grounding, yet a bit mundane after the adrenaline of the pilot launch. In a brief lull, Eleanor appeared in her doorway, a knowing smile on her face. "Heard the pilot ended with quite a flourish," she said softly, crossing her arms. "I've seen the headlines." Pierce Tech's new rideshare system is turning heads, even among cynics. "How are you holding up?" Gabriella shrugged, feeling her composure waver. Exhausted, relieved, unsure, all at once. Eleanor stepped into the office, closing the door behind her. "Transitions can be tough. You jumped into something outside your comfort zone and poured your heart into it. Now that it's done, at least the pilot phase, it's normal to feel unsettled." Gabriella nodded, rubbing a knot in her shoulder. "I guess I expected a clean sense of triumph, but instead I have all these questions. About my father, about the future with Pierce Tech, about my own life." Eleanor's expression softened. "Maybe this is the best time to reflect, figure out if there's more to this journey than a completed pilot. And about your father, well, sometimes healing old wounds can free you to move forward." The words resonated like a gentle chord. She recognized the truth in them, but still struggled to release her grip on the anger and hurt she'd carried since her father's abandonment. "I'm afraid of reopening that chapter," she admitted quietly. Eleanor took a seat, resting a hand on Gabriella's desk. "I can't tell you what to do, but I can say from experience that unspoken pain doesn't go away. It just shapes us in ways we might not want. You deserve peace." When Eleanor rose to leave, Gabriella offered a small smile. She felt raw, but in a way that signaled potential growth. The veneer of rigid control she'd once prided herself on had cracked, revealing a woman ready to embrace life's complexities. That evening, she sat alone in her apartment, gazing at the photo of her father she still kept in an old album. She remembered him as a soft-spoken man who encouraged her to read, who'd once told her she could be anything she wanted. His abrupt departure nearly 20 years ago had forged her distrust of unplanned events, driving her to structure her life with meticulous caution. Now, the intangible armor she'd worn for years felt heavier than ever. Outside, the city lights flickered across her window, and she wondered how far she had truly come from the girl who was hurt so long ago. She knew there were new roads ahead. Perhaps the biggest test wasn't the sabotage or the pilot. It was her willingness to live more openly, to risk her heart and her peace of mind for the chance at genuine connection. 2 weeks passed swiftly, filled with a mix of editorial duties and occasional visits to Pierce Tech. Gabriella noticed that, although the pilot had concluded, she still received calls from Rachel and Neil requesting her insights for marketing or investor outreach. Every time she came by, the staff greeted her with a warmth that made her feel like part of the family. Her routine at Harper Reed continued, but something in her perspective had shifted. She took less pride in meeting every minor deadline and found herself focusing on the manuscripts that had genuine potential to inspire or inform readers. Marcus picked up on her change in demeanor, noting that she seemed more alive when discussing ideas that truly mattered to her. One morning, she opened her email to find a forwarded message from Brian. The subject line read, "Upcoming Investor Conference in Miami." Skimming the text, she discovered that Pierce Tech had been invited to present at a major tech forum happening in her hometown. While the event was primarily for established companies, The invitation signaled a growing recognition of Pierce Tech's impact. Gabriella's heart fluttered with surprise and excitement. She'd just told her mother she would visit soon, and now there was a professional reason to go. She quickly replied to Brian, congratulating him and mentioning she'd be in Miami around the same dates. His response came almost immediately. It'd mean a lot if you joined us for part of the conference. The local perspective could be invaluable. Plus, I'd love your support. She smiled at the screen, feeling a mixture of anticipation and anxiety. Memories of her childhood neighborhood, the laughter with her mother, and the tension surrounding her father all came rushing back. Part of her yearned to show Brian the places that shaped her, but another part dreaded confronting the remnants of a past she'd tried to leave behind. A week later, Gabriella boarded a flight for Miami. The city welcomed her with a blanket of humid warmth, the sky a vivid blue dotted with puffy clouds. Dolores met her at the airport, arms outstretched. They embraced tightly, and Gabriella felt the sting of tears behind her eyes. It had been too long since she allowed herself a moment of familial comfort. They spent the first evening catching up over a home-cooked meal of arroz con pollo. Dolores fussed over Gabriella as if she were still a teenager, insisting she looked thinner and needed to relax. Gabriella let herself sink into the routine of setting the table with her mother and listening to the nostalgic sound of Spanish music playing in the background. Later, while drying dishes together, Dolores gently mentioned Gabriella's father. He's been trying to reach you, you know. He wrote me, asked for your number. I haven't given it to him yet because I wanted to be sure you were okay with that. Gabriella paused, a plate in hand. A tangle of conflicted emotions tightened in her chest. She recalled Eleanor's words about unspoken pain and the chance to find peace. "Thanks for waiting," she murmured. I'm not sure I'm ready, but maybe... Dolores touched her hand gently. "Take your time. Just remember that carrying anger can be heavier than offering forgiveness." The next morning, Gabriella met Brian and Rachel at the downtown convention center, where the tech forum was taking place. Palm trees framed the glass facade, and the sound of traffic mixed with the screech of seagulls overhead. Rachel wore a smart blazer in bright turquoise, matching the city's vibrant aesthetic. Brian's expression brightened when he spotted Gabriella. "Miami looks good on you," he teased lightly, gesturing to her more relaxed attire, a breezy linen blouse and beige trousers. He seemed more at ease too, perhaps enjoying the break from Manhattan's chilly spring. They set up the Pierce Tech booth amid rows of glossy corporate displays. The event buzzed with activity, large venture firms promoting new funds, entrepreneurs showing off prototypes, and tech enthusiasts circulating in excited groups. Among the crowd, Gabriella spotted a few big-name CEOs whose companies she'd once criticized in her blog. Now she was on the other side, championing an enterprise she believed in. During breaks, she shared bits of her past with Brian and Rachel. She pointed out that just a few blocks away stood the old library where she'd spent her after-school hours, devouring every book she could get her hands on. She mentioned her mother's modest home in Little Havana, describing the colorful murals and lively culture that shaped her adolescence. Brian listened intently, occasionally asking questions about her upbringing or her time at a public high school known for its underfunded programs. She felt the vulnerability of revealing these details, but it also felt liberating to let someone witness the roots she'd tried so hard to transcend. By afternoon's end, the Pierce Tech booth had drawn attention from curious investors and a handful of local rideshare drivers who were impressed by the pilot's success. Gabriella took pride in explaining how the platform empowered drivers and passengers alike, layering real-time safety features into a user-friendly interface. As the convention center lights dimmed for the evening, Brian turned to her with a contented smile. "We wouldn't be here without your support. Thank you." She looked at him, feeling the subtropical air drifting through the open entrance. "I'm glad I could help," she said softly, "and that I can finally share a piece of my world with you." Yet a silent tension hung in her mind, the question of when and if she would confront her father. The city felt both familiar and foreign, a place that held joy and heartbreak in equal measure. For the first time in years, though, she felt strong enough to handle whatever came next. On the third day of the tech forum, the Miami sun glinted off the convention center's reflective panels, heating the sidewalks to a shimmering haze. Gabriella arrived early to finalize Pierce Tech's morning presentation. While Brian and Rachel handled technical checks, she prepared a short speech highlighting the social impact of their rideshare model. When the session began, a modest audience filled the small auditorium. Entrepreneurs, policy advocates, and curious locals took their seats. Gabriella was first to speak, her nerves fluttering but under control. She introduced herself as an editor, a journalist, and an advisor who had witnessed Pierce Tech evolve under challenging circumstances. Her words flowed more candidly than her usual polished editorial style. She spoke of how technology could bridge communities instead of alienating them, emphasizing the emotional ripple effect of fair wages, safer transit, and reduced congestion. She acknowledged that her initial skepticism had gradually transformed into admiration, underscoring the importance of open-minded dialogue between critics and creators. The crowd responded with applause, and she stepped away from the podium, heart pounding in both relief and pride. Rachel followed with a demonstration of the driver interface, showcasing real-time data from the pilot. Finally, Brian delivered a vision statement that touched on expansions to other major cities, including real-time translation features for multicultural hubs like Miami. During the Q&A, a man in the audience, wearing a crisp linen shirt, stood up. "I'm a local journalist," he announced, pointing to a press badge around his neck. "Could you talk about how you handled the sabotage attempts? It's impressive you recovered so quickly." Brian glanced at Gabriella, then answered smoothly, crediting the team's vigilance and transparency. He spoke openly about the ex-consultant who'd planted the malware, and how the entire fiasco revealed the importance of trust within an organization. People in the auditorium nodded, some taking notes. When the session concluded, a handful of attendees approached the Pierce Tech team with business cards and potential partnership ideas. Gabriella felt a warm flush of satisfaction as she fielded questions about her editorial perspective on ethical tech. She noticed more than one local official praising the initiative for supporting underpaid drivers in the region. A group of college students lingered, eagerly questioning Rachel about software engineering. One of them looked at Gabriella and asked, "You said you used to critique companies like this on your blog. What made you change your mind?" She considered the question. "I didn't stop being critical," she said slowly. "But I realized that honest critique and constructive partnership aren't mutually exclusive. If a company is genuinely trying to do better, helping them reach that goal can be more effective than only pointing out flaws from the sidelines." Their eyes lit up with understanding, and they nodded, inspired. In that moment, Gabriella felt something shift. She saw how her transformation resonated, especially for younger minds who viewed success and advocacy as conflicting paths. Maybe her story could show them that one can champion innovation without abandoning ethical standards. By midday, the Pierce Tech booth buzzed with visitors. Dolores arrived unannounced, wearing a casual floral dress and her usual supportive smile. She wrapped Gabriella in a proud hug, then stood by the booth, listening to the pitch that Brian and Rachel gave to curious attendees. Gabriella introduced her mother to Brian, explaining briefly how Dolores had sacrificed to ensure her daughter's education and opportunities. Dolores beamed, speaking warmly of Gabriella's determination from a young age. Brian listened with respect, occasionally glancing at Gabriella with an expression that hinted he was learning so much more about her core. After a flurry of handshakes and conversations, Dolores pulled Gabriella aside. "I'm so proud of you, mija," she whispered, taking her hand. "Look at how you bring people together." Gabriella felt a sudden sting of emotion. She reflected on the countless hours in Manhattan, the tension and sleepless nights, and her old fear of stepping off a meticulously planned path. To have her mother see her in this new role, less guarded, more collaborative, was unexpectedly moving. A soft breeze drifted in from open windows, carrying the scent of palm trees. She realized that, although she'd come home to support Pierce Tech's expansion, she was also sharing an evolved version of herself with the city of her youth. The lessons she'd learned about trust, resilience, and hope now extended beyond just her own journey. By the late afternoon, the crowd began to thin. Gabriella gazed at the faces of people who'd listened to her story, to Brian's aspirations, to Rachel's tech marvels. She sensed an echo of her younger self in the curious eyes of those who wondered if real change was possible. Maybe, through her words and actions, she had offered an answer. On the final day of the Tech Forum, Gabriella found a spare half-hour between presentations and decided to slip away to the old neighborhood library she'd mentioned to Brian. The building stood tucked beside a community center, its sun-worn bricks a testament to years of scorching Miami summers. She stepped inside, the familiar hush of shelves and the faint smell of aged paper instantly transporting her back in time. She drifted among the rows, lightly tracing the spines of novels. Memories rushed in, how she used to read through entire weekends, determined to surpass her circumstances. The library had once been a refuge, a place that fueled her ambition. Now it felt like a place of reflection, a space where she could acknowledge how far she'd come. Her phone vibrated in her pocket. Expecting a message from Brian or Rachel about the day's final panel, she answered without looking. "Gabriella, it's your father." The voice on the other end was tentative, heartbreakingly so. Her breath caught in her throat. She wandered to a deserted corner, adrenaline spiking. How did you get this number?" She wasn't angry. She was startled by the sudden confrontation. He hesitated. "Your mother gave it to me, said if I was serious about reconnecting, I should call directly. I know I have no right to ask for your time, but I'm in Miami too. Could we talk?" Gabriella stared at the library's sunlit window. She'd prepared 1,000 imaginary speeches to unleash on him if they ever met, yet none of them felt relevant now. The old anger flared, mingled with fear and curiosity. I'm free later today," she forced out, uncertain. "We can meet at the cafe on 8th Street, by the art mural." He agreed, voice trembling with relief. After hanging up, she sank onto a bench near the children's section, her mind whirling. A glance at the time told her she'd be late to meet Brian if she didn't leave soon. With her father's voice still echoing in her head, she hurried back to the convention center. Arriving at the Pierce Tech booth, she found Brian just finishing a conversation with a potential investor. He gave her a warm smile. "Hey, I was about to text you. Everything all right?" She tried to respond casually, but the tremor in her voice betrayed her. "My father called. I'm meeting him later." Brian's expression shifted to concern. "Do you want company or moral support?" She shook her head gently. "No, I think I need to face him on my own, but thank you for offering." They spent the next few hours wrapping up the final day of the conference. Rachel closed deals on potential expansions, and Neil, who'd flown in for the grand finale, exchanged excited handshakes with prospective partners. Gabriella felt proud of how far the company had come, remembering the near collapse and sabotage attempts only weeks before, yet her thoughts drifted to the upcoming meeting, her stomach in knots. By late afternoon, she left the convention center, weaving through Miami's bustling streets until she reached the colorful mural on 8th Street depicting Cuban heritage. It was a place she used to visit for a sense of community pride. Spotting a small outdoor cafe table, she sat down, fiddling with her phone. A few minutes later, her father appeared. His hair had grayed considerably, and the lines on his face told of years that hadn't been easy. He walked up slowly, eyes filled with apprehension. "Gabriella," he murmured, almost like a plea. She let him sit, both of them quiet for a moment. She noticed how he looked at her, as if searching for the daughter he'd left behind. The heat of the late afternoon sun pressed in around them, intensifying the moment's weight. "What do you want from me?" she asked softly, not accusing, but genuinely questioning. He clasped his hands on the table. "I left because I couldn't face my own failures. I felt like I'd let you and your mother down. And once I was gone, I convinced myself I was doing you both a favor by staying away." A wave of anger sparked in her chest, but it was tempered by an unexpected sorrow. She saw a broken man who had chosen flight over confrontation. "You realize how much that hurt, don't you?" she whispered, tears threatening. He nodded, voice cracking. "I do, and I'm sorry. I know I don't deserve forgiveness, but if there's any way to at least tell you how proud I am of you, how sorry I am." She inhaled, struggling against tears. Memories she'd kept locked away rushed forth. Birthdays without him, tears in her mother's eyes, her own vow never to let anyone's unpredictability shatter her life again. But that vow had also closed her off. "It hasn't been easy," she managed. "I turned into someone who needs everything under control because I never wanted to feel that powerless again." He reached out, hesitated, then drew his hand back. "I wish I could fix the past, but I can't. All I can do is ask for a chance to know you now, to support you in whatever way I can." The old anger surged momentarily, yet she also sensed the possibility of letting go. She recalled what Eleanor said about unspoken pain shaping lives. If she held on to this rage, it might overshadow her new connections, especially with Brian. After a long silence, she nodded, tears finally escaping. "I can't promise we'll ever be close, but maybe we can start with a clean slate." His eyes shone with gratitude. She exhaled, a tremor passing through her, and in that moment she felt a weight lift. In choosing to open a path to reconciliation, she allowed herself to move forward. Later that evening, as she returned to her mother's house, her heart felt raw yet somehow lighter. She texted Brian, "Met my dad. Still processing, but I'm okay." He replied immediately, "Proud of you. Call if you need to talk." Standing in her childhood bedroom, she gazed at the faded posters on the wall, remnants of a girl who had once dreamed of conquering the world. Now, she saw a woman who was learning to navigate the unexpected with an open heart. Tomorrow, she would head back to Manhattan, resume her editorial work, and continue supporting Pierstek's journey. But this time, she wouldn't bury her vulnerabilities. She'd let them remind her that life's greatest growth often arises from moments of genuine risk, be it trusting a stranger behind the wheel, confronting old wounds, or daring to believe that love and possibility can bloom from the most unlikely errors. And as she closed her eyes, the emotional tears felt less like sorrow and more like release, a testament to how far she had come and how many beautiful chapters were yet to be written. I hope you enjoyed today's story. Subscribe to the channel so you don't miss more stories like this. Leave a like and comment below what you thought of the story. See you in the next video.